It's 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are embarking, I think, on a new era together, aren't we? It's certainly fair to say that politics constitutes quite a large part of the conversations that we have together. And in recent years, it's also been fair to say that we've managed to carve out some space together in which truth could be spoken, while much of the media seemed to be, well, at best, a little bit distracted and at worst, completely deluded. It's going to be fascinating to see how the new political reality shakes down. I derive some encouragement from the attempts we made at Optimism at previous incarnations of the last government. There were a few hours, weren't there, after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, where we felt that perhaps there would be an improvement. He would put some clear blue water between himself and what had gone before. But then, as we observed countless times, that disappeared the moment that he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office. And I would briefly remind you as well of the curse of O'Brien, when we've looked for the positive or the good in some Conservative politicians, only to have our hopes dashed to smithereens shortly afterwards, sometimes spectacularly, as in the case of Matt Hancock, and sometimes more of a sort of slow puncture, as in the case of James Cleverly. I think that I was wrong on Friday. Let's start new era, new me. I think I was wrong on Friday to suggest that Jeremy Hunt might change his mind. I've always thought that the temptation to land the biggest job was almost overweening for almost every politician. And Jeremy Hunt, I'd have thought, would have been quite well placed to mount a kind of unity leadership campaign. But it appears, as indeed Natasha Clark insisted, our political editor insisted on Friday, it appears that he feels that he has had his chance and will not be throwing his hat into the ring. In the second hour of the programme, we'll be looking at the question of what the Tory party must do now. We will try to conduct that conversation from the sort of patriotic position of recognising the importance of a healthy, non-racist and relatively sane opposition. So we'll get onto that a little later. But we begin, as we must, with the new government and the sense, I think, of optimism, born of what I'm not quite sure at this point. How much of it is born of a relatively newfound hope that they will represent some meaningful change and improvement, or how much of it is simply relief that we've got rid of the last lot? Because I don't think historians of the future will quite believe how awful things have been for the last 8 years, certainly, and in some ways for the last 14. I was looking at Starmer's first two appointments outside of his parliamentary party. He's brought James Timpson in as a prisons minister and Patrick Vallance with a science brief, a former chief scientific advisor to the government. And they were wonderful moments, politically speaking, because they did this thing that hasn't happened for ages. I mean, you remember some of the first things Boris Johnson did as Prime Minister was to put his own brother in the House of Lords, who'd resigned in protest at the prospect of his brother, Boris Johnson, being leader. It wasn't long before he'd put Nadine Dorries in the Culture, Media and Sport Department as a Secretary of Actual State, making people like Rees-Mogg. Oh, crikey, he's gone, hasn't he? Making people like Rees-Mogg, business secretary, that was Truss, wasn't it? Brexit Opportunities Minister. I mean, the madness of what's gone will be mapped, I suspect, for some time to come. But not now, not today. 7 minutes after 10 is the time. Today it's about optimism. How much of it is built upon a sense already growing that they know what they're doing, that the grown-ups are back in charge, and how much of it is simply relief that we've got rid of the last lot, and how much is actually built upon events? Because I think the most important element of optimism, the thing that changes, hope into expectation, is events. It's actually doing things. And there are already a few things out there that I suggest that they intend, if they haven't already, to hit the ground running. I mean, the tone, for example, with which they're talking about Gaza, with which David Lammy and Keir Starmer talking about Gaza is notably different. It's reported in one newspaper today that the Labour government will abandon Tory attempts to limit the ICC investigation into the possible commission of war crimes. You've got the idea of housing being prioritised above all else. Of course, lots of governments have said lots of things on these issues before. That's where you wonder how much optimism, how far optimism alone will carry us. So I thought today we'd start just talking to each other. A little bit of a sort of community get-together, just a straightforward conversation about how you're feeling now. On Friday, we dedicated quite a lot of a programme to the absence of euphoria. And yet, by the end of the programme, a lot of you were telling me that you were finally beginning to feel the euphoria. Starmer's speech on the steps of Downing Street, widely considered to have been pitch perfect. The immediate abandonment of the obscene Rwanda plan, speaking to, I think, most people about what the change of government is going to look like, what it's going to represent. I'd throw Gaza into that as well. The fact that we no longer have a Minister for Common Sense, Neil points out, is surely a reason to celebrate. And the feeling of relief continues with a new, this is from Lawrence, who's in Watford. The early feeling of relief continues with a new feel that responsible adults are in place. The way they've moved quickly to try to resolve some of the issues with junior doctors and Tata Steel are just two examples of them at least talking to the parties involved. It can only be a good thing. Long may they continue in getting on top of the mess left by the previous destructive government. So hit the numbers now, see if you want to be the first call of the new era, because Friday didn't count. Friday was election post-mortem. Now we're moving into politics. And I won't unduly detain you with this one. But I mean, I am conscious that we're going to have to change the way we do business slightly. I certainly hope that we're not going to spend another 5 years daily pointing out the depravities, immoralities and egregious conduct of the most senior politicians in government. I'm fairly confident that ain't going to happen. I don't think we've got any messiahs moving into ministries, but neither do we have delinquents or epic incompetents who have inhabited some of the great offices of state in recent years. I don't know yet how that's going to settle. I can't really remember what it was like being on air under a Labour government. Can you? It's been so long. I did 6 years. I did cut my teeth at LBC with Tony Blair and then later Gordon Brown in Downing Street. But I certainly wasn't as political back then as I am now. I think I've been radicalised by some of the abuses and excesses of recent years. But, you know, our job here is to speak truth to power. It's certainly not to tie a scarf around our neck and knot that knot so tightly that it cuts off the flow of blood to our head. Except that I don't think that the rules of engagement are going to be the same. I really don't think that you'll go. I think the bad stuff will be traditional bad stuff. You know, missteps rather than egregious lies. If someone in Keir Starmer's party gets caught breaking lobbying rules, I don't think they'll try to change the lobbying rules. I don't think people who would struggle to tie their own shoelaces unaided are going to be promoted to the great offices of state. I don't think you're going to have corruption. I don't think millions and millions and millions of pounds worth of government contracts are going to be doled out to people who have the private phone lines of senior Conservative MPs. I don't think we're going to have a Prime Minister essentially passing a hat around in pursuit of someone to pay for his home decor. I just don't think that is going to happen. So you have a bit of a crash course, perhaps. This is where my combinations of hope and optimism come from. There's a sort of crash course in how things used to be. That for me is the best thing that happened over the course of the weekend. Just a sense that they are cutting completely loose from what has gone before and just getting back to the business of trying to make the country a healthier, better place for the people that live in it, rather than dedicating so much of their political energies to improving the lots of themselves, or indeed of their donors or of their close friends in the right-wing media. And now I can hear naivety in my own voice. And that's probably where the biggest tension is, not between optimism and expectation, but between optimism and naivety. So we've got some appointments, we've got some policy announcements, we've got some distinct shifts in outlook. We've got a new Prime Minister, we've got a brand new cabinet, we've got experts being invited back into the building, but we also have recognition of the scale of the job ahead and the scale of the problems inherited. So where are you now? We won't do this again. This is the thing that you do on the first Monday morning after a general election. We sit down together, make yourself a cup of tea. Have you got a cup of tea yet? Yeah, I bet my mug's bigger than yours. You make yourself a cup of tea and you just have a little chat about where we, as a nation, as a patriotic people who want the best for each other and indeed for ourselves and for our country, where are we this morning? How optimistic are we allowing ourselves to be? Having tracked the absence of euphoria on Friday, I'm tempted just to nudge things in a slightly different direction. How optimistic are you allowing yourself to be? And how much support do the earliest actions of Keir Starmer's government give to that optimism? I mean, I think he's had a pretty good start, but I'm wondering whether or not you can feel the hopium coursing through your veins. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And do remember, as always on this programme, come at it from whatever angle you like. I've asked a very broad question. Your area of interest may be very specific. It may be very narrow. What does optimism look like in that space, in that narrow space? And yes, Christopher, coffee is perfectly acceptable. It's just any form of beverage and possibly a snack. So assemble your refreshments and prepare to chew the fat together. It's 10:15. 10:17 is the time. So random selection. The new Labour government is expected to drop an attempt to delay a decision by the International Criminal Court on whether to issue an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu over alleged war crimes in Gaza. Meet the new lot, they're the same as the old lot, already appears to be an inaccurate observation. But you are here, don't forget this, you're here for the next 5 years to caution me if you feel that the hopium is flowing a little too freely through my veins. 10:18 is the time. Patsy's in Hastings. Patsy, what would you like to say?
Oh, mate. Oh, mate.
Oh, mate. Go on.
Oh, mate. Okay. After so many years, I remember Thatcher. Yeah. I was an adult in Thatcher's time. I'm 64.
Okay.
To go through that and then go through what felt like another reincarnation, but worse and much more ruthless. And then I had to take a couple of days off work.
Right.
Because I couldn't. I was just so pent up about what was going on and about the election. Anyway, so to get the result was great. I don't know anything about Keir Starmer, but already I'm starting to get very, very excited about who he's put in the cabinet.
Why?
And because you've got people who understand. I tell you what I'm so excited about. And on Saturday morning...
You're already making me worried now. Because I'm hearing the levels of excitement in you. And I'm thinking, crikey, the bigger the balloon, the louder the pop.
No, because the cortisol that's been running through my veins for years, each time it gets worse and worse, now it feels like I can sleep. But I woke up on Saturday morning to see James Timpson.
James Timpson, yes.
Now, I spent a lot of my working time for years working with NEETs, not in education, employment and training.
Yes.
So I would see these young people either let down by education that was all the cutbacks, we don't need that. I used to work in soft skill, which was actually confidence building and getting them to understand their own emotional load. And they'd say, no, we don't need that because we need this.
Yeah.
And you'd watch these people that weren't being heard, that were either getting let down by the education system, that you knew at some point they're likely to go into our
prison system. Yeah.
Prison system.
And I mean, it's so blindingly obvious to people within it, and yet the rhetoric without. That's another thing that hopefully the days of feeling like the government is making decisions based on 1980s radio phone-ins are hopefully behind us.
Yeah. most deaf.
Sort of hang 'em, flog 'em kind of thing.
So I popped in. Ironically, I had a bit of dry cleaning to pick up, and I very rarely have dry cleaning. And I walked in and I said to the lad there, I said, "So, you're governor?" Said, he said, "Yeah, he's got an OBE." I said, "No,
not that.
He's now a minister. That's big. That's really big. It's not a gong. This is a minister."
No, it is. He's got House of Lords as well. That'd be part of the appointment.
Of course. Well, that'll be longevity, won't it? And that'll be a big influence. But he just stood there. He said, "We're so excited." Yeah. This young man. He said, "We're so excited." He said, "Because I went and I went on a training thing for the new offenders." He said, "And they're really nice people." And I stood there and I had to stand with this lad and I went, "I'm finding it very difficult to contain my emotional load."
I think that's I suppose if you were struggling to contain your emotional load, in many ways, a dry cleaners is probably the best place to be, Patsy. But I think that idea of bringing people into the heart of government who have a proven interest in what they're doing shouldn't feel shocking. It shouldn't feel shocking.
No, but it's been staring us in the face for so long.
I hadn't clocked that before. Oh my God, they've hired someone to work on prisons who's the chair of the Prison Reform Trust. What are they thinking? How could this possibly work? Was Esther McVeigh not available? It's just
exactly. But we can look at rehabilitation, James, not incarceration, because a lot of those guys. Let's look at that.
I think you're right. I could listen to you all day. I don't know why. Your enthusiasm is quite infectious, contagious even. But I've got, as you'd expect, a very, very busy switchboard this morning. But I'm so glad you've picked up on that first. Not just the appointment, but reminding us that he was chair of the Prison Reform Trust. He walks the walk, James Timpson. I can happily recommend the Full Disclosure episode with him from only weeks ago. Certainly the last couple of months, I think. It was no longer than that. And I sat there. And Patsy will appreciate this. And I may even have said something to you afterwards. I sat there and I just thought, why don't the politicians ever put the people like this in proper positions of power? Timpson's brother was a Conservative MP and quite a good egg, by all accounts, well thought of departmentally. And he did a lot of great work in the arena of adoption, which, as you know, I care passionately about. The Timpson family, the Timpson mother and father, fostered 80-odd children over the course of their lifetime. So that idea of nurturing society, giving things back to society, even from a position of privilege, is, I would cautiously suggest, the polar opposite of what we've got used to before. So bringing in someone with quite strong and bold ideas to an area of historic controversy, that's a pretty good opening move, a pretty good opening gambit. Of course, it puts pressure on James Timpson to deliver, but he's got a very, very, very long track record of delivering. Little things that make me proud to have someone like that in our government is that if you're unemployed and you've got a job interview, they'll clean your suit for free, male or female. Patsy mentioned being in a dry cleaners. We most obviously associate Timpson with key cutting. But they'll clean your suit for free if you're unemployed and you've got a job interview. Why would you do that? Just doing something that has no gain for you, but is good for your community or your society or your country. And you can laugh at me for naivety all you want, but that simple fact, to me, represents meaningful change from what's gone before. Jackie's in Stuttgart. Jackie, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. I think you're going to hear this quite a lot today.
What?
Friday, I was still a bit too shell-shocked to be ecstatic, but then Saturday, as we watched people being put into positions in government that were best suited to be in those positions in government, not because they were mates, but because they were experienced in the field or interested in the field, it just felt so idiotic. It felt so novel. Let's have people doing this job that know what they're doing. And then when I found out about James Timpson, I burst into tears.
Did you really?
Yeah. I'd listened to the podcast with him, the Full Disclosure podcast, and the idea, we've gone from Rishi Sunak, who one of the first people to put back into government was a ghoul like Braverman, who wants people on planes and sunken boats, to one of the first big appointments that Starmer's made is a man who really knows about how people suffer when they go to prison. And what a waste of money it is building more prisons. We need to do more to
Well, it's Daily Mail front pages,
people.
Isn't it? It's government by Daily Mail front pages. And most obviously on immigration, where they have to say things publicly that they know that aren't true privately. I suspect the same is true of prisons. Everybody must recognise the role that rehabilitation plays in improving the country, but they're terrified of getting a spanking from a right-wing newspaper. So knit together the first few days of Keir Starmer's premiership, and they don't seem to be that worried about getting a spanking from right-wing newspapers, do they?
No, they don't, and they've gone straight out of the gate towards the EU and looking at. Well, not. They said we're not going to redo Brexit, but
I wouldn't get your hopes up too high in that.
No,
department.
but we could realign and try to renegotiate better trade deals and trade agreements. Maybe some liberty of motion, sort of reciprocal liberty of motion,
something like
that. So yeah, I've gone from being stunned and shell shocked at the size of the win to now being really optimistic that it looks like they've actually meant what they said. They've hit the ground running.
And yet, that perhaps the most interesting change then in the first few days is this notion of excitement, because his personal polling,
competence.
Well, but his personal polling was quite low. I mean, he goes into Downing Street with one of the lowest personal polling approval rates ever for a victorious.
But I think he played a blind. He didn't make too many promises. And
but
that's
it's
the thing
changing
that
already, is what I'm hearing in the early calls to the programme this morning.
Yeah, he didn't make promises that he knew he couldn't keep. But now he's starting to do things that he didn't promise, but that are they're wow. They shouldn't be wow.
It's like he couldn't wait to get his hands on the levers of power because he actually wants to do things.
And it really suits him. He looks so relaxed and so comfortable.
Well, we'll see. Watch that hopium, Jackie. Watch that hopium. But yeah, there is a distinct change in tone that comes, I imagine, partly with relief and partly with the difference between campaigning and governing. This is nice from Jordan. I work for Timpson's in one of his shops, and I'm not a massive Keir Starmer Labour supporter, but I am of this. What an amazing step. The man is genuinely a good person. This would be great for prisons. I've worked with 3 people from the prison system who now work for Timpson's, and they are thriving. And then, of course, you've got Patrick Vallence's new job, and you've got the new Attorney General, Richard Hermer, an experienced lawyer who, for people worried about the continuing carnage of innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, has spoken out against Israeli breaches of international law on several occasions. So the thing that was really beginning to frustrate me, the idea, they're all the same, that's probably at the top of his to-do list, to reassure and prove that they're not all the same at all. And I think he's making a fairly good start at that. Remember, as I bid farewell to Jackie or to Patsy, it frees up a phone line for you. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Brian is in Belfast. Brian, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. First-time caller, long-time listener.
Welcome.
I love your show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I was going to come at this from quite a few different angles, but one of the biggest ones is that whenever Tony Blair got into power, he was near enough in association with the Sun newspaper. They backed him. The Sun have not gone anywhere near Keir Starmer.
But they did offer up a cautious endorsement towards the end of last week, but you certainly didn't get the impression that Keir Starmer cared one way or the other. And
I think with James Timpson and Sir Patrick Vallance, and that whenever you first hear about that, it's through the official channels, not through newspapers. So, Rupert Murdoch, I think, is at arm's length from the levers of power, and I think that's fantastic. One of my biggest loves on this is the fact that Angela Rayner is Deputy Prime Minister. Now, somebody who never went to Eton, never privileged. I listened to her Full Disclosure podcast with you and absolutely gobsmacked how amazing it was. Yeah. And she wants to help people. Isn't it?
That is a story.
Yeah.
From a single mother and growing up with her own mother was illiterate, as you'll know from that interview, and she's now Deputy Prime Minister. That's a magnificent testament.
That to me, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and nothing can stop her, because we can now see people like that in charge and going, right, I can do that. I don't need to go to Eton. Whenever David Cameron looks in the mirror, he thinks he sees a brilliant politician. He thinks he sees Keir Starmer, but he doesn't. Keir Starmer is in politics to help people. That is the biggest difference.
That's the impression that
for all of us.
Yeah, and the cautiousness or the caution with which he campaigned, I gave people pause. It gave people concerns, and the prioritisation of removing those concerns, removing that pause by essentially stepping away from that caution has begun in earnest almost from day one. I'm going to take something Brian said and put it on my list. And whether or not this is deliberate or just coincidence, you need lucky generals, as I think Napoleon most famously observed. I don't know whether he's lucky that the planets are realigning or whether he is part of the process of that realignment. But I sense, and this is another reason why I'm going to have to come up with new approaches to the news, I sense that the right-wing media, the stranglehold of that Murdoch, Paul Dacre media, Telegraph, well, they've gone completely bonkers. They did some time ago. I mean, what role do they play? When they were hysterical in their support of the utter incompetence of Liz Truss or the moral depravity of Boris Johnson, they can be as hysterical as they like in critiquing Keir Starmer, but it will be as evidence-based of their faith in Liz Truss's economic abilities and economic talent. So I think you're looking at the first Labour government of my lifetime that won't be worrying about the front page of tomorrow's Daily Mail. But again, I'm completely conscious of either naivety or an excess, a surfeit of optimism. Thank you, Brian. It's 10:32. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 10:33 is the time. Yeah, you're right, actually. Tim's just reminded me of this. It popped into my mind while Brian was talking to us from Belfast. The graph they've put together of how the members of the cabinet were educated is extraordinary. Just 4% of the new cabinet were educated at private school. It's one of my favourite subjects for a whole heap of reasons. My relationship with private education is complicated and frequently pretty close to hypocritical. But I do know the difficulties that people have in understanding realities that they have never experienced. And that speaks to two things to me. It's arguably the death of entitlement in our cabinet, because there's no way. There's two members of this cabinet who went to the same comprehensive school in Manchester, and no one who went to Eton. So, and look, for good or for ill, it speaks to the disappearance of politicians who think that this is something they were born to, and that can happen in the Labour Party as well. Don't get me wrong; it's more commonplace in the Tory Party, but the idea that even at the age of 10, 11, 12, you're thinking, well, a prep school, Summerfield, Eton, Oxford, possibly make some money in the city, they get a job at the Conservative Research Department, fight a couple of no-hope seats to show willing, and then by the time I'm 35, 40, nice little berth in the House of Commons and have a tilt for the big jobs by the time I'm 50. And that's gone. These are people who have ended up in politics via much more interesting and human routes, not least Angela Rayner, but also, of course, Keir Starmer himself. And that I think is I was expecting this to go the other way. I thought I'll start off optimistic and you'll start chipping away. But I would not be surprised if Starmer's personal approval polling is higher a month in than it was a month out. 10:35 is the time. Richard's in Shrewsbury. Richard, what would you like to say?
I think you're right on that last point. And I think throughout the campaign, Sunak was trying to say they don't have a plan. And I think Starmer actually did have a plan. He just didn't want to tell people what it was, because there are things which are quite radical and therefore open to attack, like appointing someone that you've previously worked with as Attorney General. There's an easy attack line there, isn't there? Although I think it is a brilliant appointment, as your other callers have said.
Well, and to be fair, it's a lawyer of immense reputation. It's not just someone he was sitting next to at a dinner party last week or something.
He's been a KC since I think about 1993 or something crazy like that. And he is a human rights lawyer. So if you're going to change the tone of discourse in this country, scrapping Rwanda and appointing a human rights lawyer to be Attorney General day one is a pretty good way of going about it. And I say this as someone who is pretty lukewarm about Starmer.
Well, and do you know, one of the interesting things about his very recent track record is that he described Israel's siege on electricity, water and food as likely being in breach of international law. So, and that, of course, was one of the millstones that was hung around Starmer's neck from the left, if you like. I don't think that's an entirely fair or accurate depiction. But the Tories could hardly go after him for being too supportive of Israel, because that historically is their shtick. But, of course, he's hired someone here who said the opposite of what Starmer said in that unfortunate interview with Nick.
And he did that in a letter to David Lammy, an open letter along with other lawyers. And he happens to be Jewish himself as well, which I suppose shores up attacks from the other side, doesn't it? Particularly with the history that Starmer's dealt with incredibly well. I will give him that, of getting rid of anti-Semitism as much as is possible in any party. I think Angie Rayner, I think the fact that she is housing, as well as, Deputy Prime Minister, brilliant, but the fact that she is housing, having lived in social housing, I think
that's an astonishing juxtaposition, isn't it? Housing, having lived in social housing. I wonder if it won't be the first time ever. There'll be Labour politicians of yore who grew up in council housing, but it does feel very different from what has gone before, doesn't it?
And to grow up in council housing doesn't necessarily mean you struggled, but I think to be a single mum at a very young age in council housing probably did come with a set of struggles that very privileged people cannot understand. I said to your producer, I was a social worker in Birmingham for a long part of my career, and I don't think there was a single case where housing was not mentioned as a contributing factor to whatever the problem was.
Wow. And therefore, but again, it's almost as if with every contribution, we're reminded of the scale of the challenge ahead, because if they don't start turning around housing tout suite, then all of these problems are going to remain. And I think that the more hope that you place in them, the more scope there is for them being disillusioned or seeing your hopes dashed. So you'll come after them perhaps with even more appetite than you would have done if they hadn't made the big promises, or if they hadn't engendered the big hopes in the first place. Richard, thank you. I hadn't thought of that. That letter that Richard refers to, he's obviously done his homework, was a letter from dozens of lawyers who co-signed a Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights letter calling on the UK government to constructively participate in an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israeli actions in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza. I'll read you a little bit of it, because it does mark a sea change in government attitudes, that this man is now the Attorney General. The Israeli and he was one of the signatories to this letter. The Israeli government is led by a coalition of far-right parties whose common goal is the formal annexation of the West Bank and the extension of one-state reality of unequal rights over more than 5 million Palestinians under occupation. It's perfectly possible that the court will consider aspects of that situation to amount to apartheid. An ICJ opinion on this point would also assist the UK, given that the current position of the UK government is that the question of apartheid is one to be decided by a court and not one that politicians can resolve without that. And that is from earlier this year, and it is reported this morning that the new Labour government is expected to drop an attempt to delay a decision by the International Criminal Court on whether to issue an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu over alleged war crimes in Gaza. So it's all changed there. Negativity welcome. Reasons not to be cheerful. 0345 60 60 973. It may be a bit early for that. You can't really start picking holes in what they've done until they've done a little bit more. But do feel free to caution callers who are sounding upbeat, who are sounding optimistic, who are sounding hopeful with evidence-based analysis. Don't ring me to tell me that Gordon Brown sold our gold reserves 20 years ago or similar. I don't know that is a helpful contribution to public discourse, although, of course, it remains a very popular intervention on your Uncle Keith's Facebook page. It's 10:41. Peter's in Kefalonia. Kalimera.
Hello, James.
Hello, Peter. What would you like to say?
Well, as you know, I'm a Conservative Party member, so I should be feeling down in the dumps. But au contraire, I actually was pleased to see Starmer get elected. I think he's exactly the right person to be Prime Minister after the shambles over the last few Prime Ministers that we've had. I mean, he's a man of character because of what he's done previously, achieving the status of Director of Public Prosecutions.
Yes.
And he will have been vetted to within an inch of his life for that job.
Yes.
So there's no skeletons in his closet, so to speak. His appointments over the weekend, I went... As soon as the last caller spoke about the Attorney General, I won't go on too long, but as soon as I saw that, I thought, we're going to start approaching human rights from the point of view of knowledge rather than something to throw red meat at the assembled Conservative Party conference.
Well, he is. He is a lawyer of international repute, and
for sure,
and an expert on international law.
Yeah, and of course, immigration is going to be a key issue that they have got to deal with, but doing it from the point of view of knowing the law rather than just coming up with something that will please a few backbenchers strikes me as a much better idea.
And you can't. I mean, you mentioned your Tory party membership at the outset, but I have to double check some stuff, Peter, because I think I must have misremembered that, and that's happening already. I'm thinking, I was about to say to you, and of course, Suella Braverman was Attorney General under the Tories, despite having a legal career notable for precisely nothing except some fibs that she told about helping to write a book when the author revealed all she'd done was a little bit of photocopying. And then I'm thinking, no, I must have misremembered that. Maybe she was a Minister for Justice. She can't have been the actual Attorney General, but of course she was. So if you needed to highlight the biggest differences from the start, you would compare those two appointments, wouldn't you?
Liz Truss was at one stage, you will remember this,
yes,
Lord Chancellor. And when the Daily
I'd have to
Mail,
double
to
check
their
that.
eternal shame,
Yes,
said the enemies of the people,
yes,
she kept stum.
She didn't speak up for the judiciary, for the independent judiciary.
And so for the last... some considerable time, the country has been stagnating, and it really needed an injection of difference. And just go through. It's like he was picking the targets. Bridget Phillipson,
yes,
who's the Education Secretary, free school meals.
Yeah.
Somebody's mentioned Angela Rayner, social housing. Timpson does a well-known expert on rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And they've already moved to take some of the pressure out of the supply side in terms of prisons by saying they're going to do even more early release of appropriate cases, and that's got to be right because our prisons are going to explode.
If you had to distill it down to a single sea change, you'd be looking at decisions being made and appointments being made with an eye on improving the status quo, improving and not caring a jot about anything else at the moment. Certainly not caring a jot about how the Daily Mail's going to report it.
There's that, and also in terms of not being too over-concerned about political relationships within your own party. There's a steal there. Appointing Hermer as AG and effectively dropping Emily Thornberry. I've got no views either way.
No, it's quite ruthless.
On that.
She's got every right to feel aggrieved, hasn't she, at that, I think? And
she may well do, but she's got a brain on her, and I'm sure she can see the wisdom of what he's done.
Different job. What about your lot, then? What about the Tories, the party of which you remain a member? What's going to happen to them moving forward?
At the moment, I'd say. But the issue from my point of view is that I am not seeing the same response from the Conservative Party senior people that Starmer articulated when he took over the leadership of the Labour Party, when he said, we've got to take something from this. It's not the electorate's fault. It's down to us. And you're looking at probably 10 years.
And they're vying at the moment. Some of the key players in that looming leadership contest seem to be arguing that we didn't go far enough down the road of division and toxic rhetoric, and that is why the electorate abandoned us. Which, again, I don't know how we're going to phrase this question when we come onto the subject of the Tory leadership battle. There's a difference between what's good for people who don't like Tories and what's good for people who do like Tories, and what's good for people in between those two positions who would probably prefer a Labour government but recognise the importance of having a healthy opposition. Those are the people whose views perhaps I'm most interested in. 10:46 is the time. Some more appointments coming through now. I could just picking up some, I don't call them highlights necessarily, but Chris Bryant is going into the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology and the Department for Culture, Media and Sports as a Minister of State. So a big job for Chris Bryant. Angela Eagle, Minister of State in the Home Office. Maria Eagle, her sister, Minister of State in the Ministry of Defence. Heidi Alexander going into Justice. Stephen Kinnock, a Minister of State in the Department of Health and Social Care. One of the moments of Friday afternoon was when Keir Starmer encountered Neil Kinnock in the groupings, I think outside Downing Street. It may have been somewhere else, and that was an interesting historical encounter, given that Kinnock, of course, came so close, and Starmer has got over the line. 10:47 is the time. 0345 60973 is the number that you need. We will move on to the imminent Tory leadership battle, but I don't want this to sound sort of tokenistic or like an attempt, a dreadful BBC attempt at false balance. But what are the reasons not to be cheerful? I mean, listen, if I get an uninterrupted queue of people waiting to share their optimism and their enthusiasm, up to and including Peter there, a self-described Conservative Party member, then that's the nature of the beast. That is the direction that the conversation has gone in. I have no control over it whatsoever, except to remind you that you are more than welcome, encouraged even, to ring in and sound the alarm bell. Give me the reasons not to be cheerful, things that you think, having seen him in action for 2 or 3 days, demonstrate an unfitness for purpose from the new Prime Minister. Appointments that you think are appalling. 0345 6060 973. The new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, the first ever female Chancellor, currently giving her first speech in that role. We'll be catching up with some of the content of that shortly. But for now, the time is 10:48. 10:51 is the time. It is it's actually a little bit remarkable, even for someone who does this stuff for a living and even has written a book about what I see as a profound national decline, as you know. Some of the stuff I've forgotten. I genuinely had to double check that Suella Braverman had been the actual Attorney General. And Peter reminding us that Liz Truss was the Lord Chancellor for a while, Secretary of State for Justice. That was under Theresa May, who sometimes gets quite an easy ride in the catalogue of calumny and corruption that has been in place since 2016. So, yeah, he's absolutely right. That disgusting front page, arguably the worst front page of my lifetime. The Enemies of the People front page that Paul Dacre festooned on the front of the Daily Mail in an absolutely unhinged, provocative, insightful, profoundly dangerous attack upon the independent judiciary. The person who would be politically expected to come to their defence was Liz Truss, who did absolutely nothing. Suella Braverman having a stint as Attorney General when her legal experience, by her own account, the highlight of her legal career was helping to contribute to a legal textbook, and when the author of said textbook was made aware of the claims on her webpage, he gave an interview to The Big Issue in which he revealed that he thinks he might have asked her to do some photocopying once, but that was the full extent of her input. Which is, not to say that she didn't do lots of amazing things as a lawyer, but if she had, she probably wouldn't have had to embellish a brief stint doing some photocopying into a claim of almost co-authorship. 10:53 is the time. Ian's in Birmingham. Ian, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Lovely to talk to you. I'm not a first-time caller.
Welcome.
I think if we count Mr. Alice, this is the third time I've spoken to you, but it's lovely to get on.
Likewise.
The incoming Labour government have a big challenge and a big opportunity, and it's the same thing that's causing both of that. The last lot was so bad that just doing the basics right looks really good.
That's true.
The last lot was so bad there's a huge amount they need to fix.
So, you're absolutely right. It's two sides of the same coin, isn't it? So, look at the new lot, they're the same as the old lot, is clearly not true. But, of course, the old lot have left behind a legacy in almost every area. You think obviously of the health service or the schools, the state of schools. The state of education is not that bad, but the state of schools is pretty awful. And then the big ticket stuff like the immigration issues and small boats, everything really is vying to get to the top of the to-do list, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's going to be difficult. But I've gone from relieved at the result, I'm a proper political geek, so I watched most of election night, to feeling increasingly positive about it over the weekend. And it's things like the announcements of Patrick Vallance and Timpson have been hugely encouraging. It's like, oh, this is serious. They want to actually make things better.
And the fact that they want to be involved as well, possibly, is something we've overlooked so far. So Patrick Vallance...
Simpson saying yes and Vallance saying yes is a good sign, isn't it?
Exactly. And Vallance in particular could have been forgiven for wanting to go nowhere near a public profile ever again in his life, given some of the madness that unfolded during lockdown. And Timpson, brother a Conservative MP, I don't know what his politics are historically, but Starmer's already created an air of prioritising competence over tribalism or over partisanship.
If you can do the job well, I want to employ you. You've sort of stolen one of my expressions, but I'll let you off because I have an audience of about 3 when I say it, and you have an audience of 5 million, I think it is. For the last 14 years, and Cameron was guilty of this as well, although not as bad as Johnson and May particularly, is government by tabloid headline.
Yes.
Every announcement was about what's the headline, how does it look, never mind whether it works or not, never mind whether it's a good thing. It's let's get the headline and then go from there. And it's a disaster because it just doesn't work.
No, well, it works in the sense of we got the headline that we wanted, but in every other measurable way, it creates more harm than good. It does the opposite of helping. Cummings has written about this, about living in constant thrall.
If we don't agree with Cummings, that's going to upset me.
You're sorry, I can only apologise for that. But isn't it interesting how, I think, didn't he talk about Starmer as being a kind of one-term opposition leader who'd be out on his backside before...
Yes.
Tea time. I get more evidence of his galaxy brain kicking in, but I think you're right. I don't know though. I mean, that is where I am almost certainly overdosing on hopium when I think that the stranglehold that unhinged right-wing media figures have upon our political discourse could be loosened. If they look, they're in for 5 years. They've got a massive majority. There is nothing to stop them completely ignoring these people, and the more that they are ignored, possibly, the less relevant they become.
Yeah, the government's got to be brave, but the signs so far is they will be. We'll just have to see. The other thing that encouraged me greatly, your researcher noted that I work in the NHS.
Oh, yes.
Is within hours of taking post, Wes Streeting, who I must admit there's certain scepticism amongst my colleagues about lots of things he said, but within hours of taking office, he phoned the BMA and negotiations are happening this week. I mean, that's just basically getting on with the job and doing what needs to be done.
Yes, doesn't mean it'll work. But it is getting on with the job and getting on with what needs to be done. Ian, thank you. 10:56 is the time. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, has been with the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. How long before you stop automatically saying shadow in your head and remember that it was a bit like watching the football and thinking, why are they singing God Save the King? Oh, good, look, yes, it's not God Save the Queen anymore. So it's not Shadow Home Secretary anymore, it's Home Secretary. What has she been up to, Natasha?
Morning, James. Yes, I've been with the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, in South East London this morning. She's been visiting a police station in Lewisham for her first official week in the job. Obviously, she's still been working over the weekend, setting up the first steps of that new border command centre that she says is going to help crack down on the criminal gangs that are smuggling people across the channel. I was interested to ask her whether she'd been in touch with the Rwandan government and whether there was any progress on getting any of those millions of pounds that has been spent on Britain's Rwanda policy back to the UK.
The Rwandan scheme that the Conservatives have set up has clearly spent hundreds of millions of pounds on a scheme that's been running for 2.5 years and has sent just 4 volunteers to Rwanda. We are now auditing the whole programme, looking at the legislation, and we'll set out more steps to Parliament in due course. But the first thing we have to do is to get the new Border Security Command in place to make sure that we can go after the criminal gangs that are organising these dangerous boat crossings, undermining border security and putting lives at risk.
So you're still looking for that refund from them, just to be clear?
We're looking now and we're auditing the whole of the Rwandan scheme that the Conservatives have set up. It has clearly been a complete con, and we will set out the next steps in due course. But the most important thing right now is to get the Border Security Command in place.
So that's Yvette Cooper confirming to me just a few minutes ago that she will be making a whole audit of the whole Rwandan policy in an attempt to try and get back some of that money. She said previously she wanted to try and get any of it back in a refund if that was possible. It's not quite clear whether she has spoken to the Rwandan government about this, but she's conducting a whole review of the scheme, which obviously has been officially scrapped by Keir Starmer on Saturday. He confirmed that scheme was now dead in the water. Those flights to Rwanda would now not take off. Another row that's been brewing in the Labour Party in the government, I should say, in the last few days has been over ID cards. We've seen Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, try to introduce ID cards when he was Prime Minister. He has now called on the government to use them partly as an attempt, as he says, to control and to look and to be aware of the number of people coming in and out of the country. But I asked Yvette Cooper whether she would like to see ID cards. She said no.
No, the key issue is around enforcement. There are issues around enforcement of illegal working, but that's because the scale of the enforcement just isn't there. And that's why we have had in our manifesto a commitment to set up a new returns and enforcement unit to make sure that the rules are properly enforced, to make sure that those who have no right to be here are returned and that those returns increase. And we need to make sure that we really have a proper, functioning, properly controlled and managed migration system. That is not what we have inherited from the Conservatives. There is a lot of work to do.
So no need for ID cards then?
No, the real issue is around how you make sure you increase enforcement, and that's what we will do with a new returns and enforcement unit.
Yvette Cooper speaking just a few minutes ago to me outside Lewisham Police Station. She says there's no need for ID cards. She says it's all about the enforcement. She says Labour will set up a new returns deal to make sure that people who are not, have no right to be here, will continue to face the correct course of action. But we have heard calls earlier today from some other senior Labour figures, including Alan Johnson, the former Home Secretary, who thought that they might be quite a good idea.
He's very persuasive, actually, Alan Johnson. Just to be clear, I think the current estimate on the Rwanda thing is £310 million.
Gosh, a lot of money, isn't it, James?
Where is it? Do we know where it is, Natasha? I mean,
so a lot of it's been sent to Rwanda, so for their government to set up the processes, to set up the hotels, to set up the lawyers, right. Also, dealing with it here in the Home Office, the staff that have been needed to staff it, obviously,
so they won't get that
detaining people, the planes. We're probably not going to get a good chunk of it back, James, but Yvette Cooper, when I spoke to her a few months ago, was quite keen to do all she could to try and get some of that money back. But yes, I think you're probably right. It's unlikely we're going to get all of it back.
One thing does occur to me, that the fox that was set, or that the Tory parties tried to animate in the election campaign, that Keir Starmer didn't have a plan, that fox has already been shot, hasn't it? On day 3, or technically, I suppose, day 2, day 1.
Well, I think the Border Force Command that Yvette Cooper and the Labour Party and now the government, sorry, I should keep saying Labour Party, it's still so hard to get used to. They obviously have their own plans. I think what we don't have yet is a detail on exactly how it's going to work, who's going to head it up and how.
No, but I meant more broadly.
More
broadly, that this raft of appointments of Valance and Timpson and others, and the return of people like Jackie Smith, this stuff wasn't conjured up on Saturday night. That this clearly was a plan and it was in place. He just hadn't felt any particular need to share it with members of our profession previously.
Yeah, and I think there is an argument to that. Of course, they were trying to get elected and, they were doing so well in the polls. Arguably, they didn't need to set out some of the details of their own policy. But hopefully now they are in power, in place, we will be hearing from them a lot more about exactly what the details are, because, they are now the government and we now rightly will hold their feet to the fire on exactly what they're going to do and how.
And starting perhaps with those ID cards, which may be the first mistake that they've made, and it is a mistake that they've made on day 1. I say that with the words of Alan Johnson ringing in my ears, and the knowledge of how many countries have such a scheme in place, to no apparent detriment of the traditional concerns. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, spending her morning with the Home Secretary. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, currently setting out the national mission to boost economic growth. I'm going to need new catchphrases, aren't I? And I think that line of Napoleon's about you need lucky generals is probably going to be one that bounces around the studio a little bit, because economic growth may continue to improve gently regardless of the change of government, but I don't think there'd be any prizes for guessing who'd claim the credit for it. It's 11:03 now. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. ID cards do not represent a row within government, James. Alex's quotes, not mine. Blair, Johnson and Blunkett are not in government and haven't been for a very long time. This is about former New Labour ministers resurrecting one of their own abandoned policies. It doesn't mean it's not a mistake, though, Alex, but I grant your guidance on vocabulary. And now we turn to the Tories. This is going to be a bit tricky, actually, as a conversation. For a start, there are two conversations to have about what the Tories do next. There's the conversation that springs from a place where you want a competent Conservative Party to be restored. And there's a conversation that springs perhaps from the place where you don't. And there are two reasons why you might not. You might be on Nigel Farage's latest bandwagon, or you might be dedicated to decades of Labour rule. Both positions would probably speak to a desire not to see the Conservative Party sort itself out anytime soon. And that is partly why the scale of the problems that they face are likely to be a little bit ignored by some of the leadership contenders. I mean, how much do you know about how it's breaking down already? So you've got Honest Bob Jenrick in the frame, best known, of course, for ordering that murals at a detention centre for unaccompanied child refugees be painted over, lest the environment be too warm and welcoming for some of the most traumatised children on the planet. I mean, this feels like the good old days, doesn't it? Because you sometimes struggle to believe what comes out of your own mouth in the context of what some of these characters have spent the last few years doing. So we're living in a space now where a politician best known for trying to deprive some of the most traumatised children on the planet of murals sees himself as well placed to launch a bid for the Tory leadership. And he probably is relatively well placed. Suella Braverman, I'm reading this morning in right-leaning newspapers, has already shot her bolt, as it were. The support that she would rely upon appears to already be hemorrhaging. Probably not a great idea to write a letter attacking your own party's election strategy and prospects before the votes had actually been cast. So she's in the mix. Someone called Victoria Atkins has thrown her hat into the ring. Priti Patel is reported to be considering a leadership bid. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Suella Braverman and her various tenures in the Home Office is that she ended up making Priti Patel look relatively moderate. But she's back once again, probably not like a renegade master. Some of the other names, Tom Tugendhat is reported to be considering a bid. He would probably be seen as the most moderate of the names currently on the list, although I don't know enough about Victoria Atkins to say that with absolute certainty. What needs to happen? What do you think should happen? What do you want to happen? We've had some successful phone-ins in recent years where I've confined the conversation to Conservative supporters. You know, it achieves two things. It makes for a more engaging experience, and it also, you know, deals with any fears or suspicions that we run a risk of being an echo chamber. So if you actually confine contributions to self-described Conservative voters, Conservative supporters, you come up with a slightly different conversation in some ways. So we'll start off doing that. What do the Conservative Party need to do? What does the new leader need to look like? And crucially, what does the new leader need to do? Now, that might nudge us into territory of who does the new leader need to be. But oddly, I'm more interested in the mission than I am in the name at this moment, because it seems to me a fairly clear dichotomy opening up. And that would be that some of them think they need to do more of the same. They need to do more toxic rhetoric on Rwanda or immigration or whatever it may be. Almost attempt, if you like, to steal Nigel Farage's lunch. Or they need to recognise that the result for the limited company that Farage owns is roughly the same as it was for UKIP in 2015. So an awful lot of the coverage there is a little bit hysterical. So you write off the the people who can be seduced with racism and nativist snarls, and focus instead on moving the party back to the territory that Keir Starmer has successfully inhabited. If you think about the what's called the Overton window, as in the sort of parameters of political engagement, Starmer has smashed it. The Overton window. What is traditional Conservative Party territory now, or traditional Labour Party territory? It's almost impossible to say so. The Tories have rushed so far and so fast to the right that Starmer has sort of almost been left with all of the middle ground by default, without even having to do much. It's part of the reason why the scale of his victory is much greater than the scale of his vote. There were not people marching in to the booths high upon Keir Starmerism. They were instead marching into the booths determined to get rid of the Tories. That's why the Liberal Democrats have done so well. The numbers, as we spent almost the entire weekend hearing, the numbers are not that fantastic for the Labour Party in the context of votes cast, but in the context of seats secured, they're unimaginably good. And in the context of Conservative losses, it's their worst result ever. So, what do you want the Tory party to do now? And I'd like that question in the first instance to be asked by people who have voted for it, or even who did vote for it. I have to confess to being a little bit baffled as to the motivations of the people who voted for the Tory party this time round. I mean, in an objective universe, in a truly objective universe, I don't see how they could have won any seats at all, unless you were a magnificent constituency politician who campaigned solely on your record in your own region. It speaks to the tribalism of politics, doesn't it, that some people were still voting for the party responsible for the last 14 years. But if you are one of those people, or if, like our earlier caller Peter, you are a Tory member or a dyed-in-the-wool Tory supporter who just reached the end of your tether with this incarnation of the party, what do you want to happen next? I mean, there's two questions, isn't there, really? There's the question of what you want to happen. 0345 6060 973. There's the question of what you think will happen, which may be very different. 0345 6060 973. And there may be a third question here as well, which is a kind of what needs to happen. If you're coming from it objectively, impartially, as somebody who recognises the importance of sane opposition, what needs to happen? Because I do look at people like Braverman and think that you're going to be embarking upon a mad dash further to the right. And who voted Tory last Thursday is probably a question that we might get onto as well in the course of some of our pontifications. But let's just start with that. So some of the names in the frame include Suella Braverman, Honest Bob Jenrick, Victoria Atkins. Priti Patel is reported to be sounding people out. Tom Tugendhat believes he can reach across the party and appeal to both those who were denied their seats by reform and those who were run close by the Liberal Democrats. I think that's probably going to be the central question of this conversation. Is that even possible? Is it possible to appeal simultaneously to voters who were tempted by the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davies' upbeat boosterism, and at the same time appeal to voters tempted by Nigel Farage's ragtag band of racists and weirdos? I mean, that is a big, big challenge for any future Tory leader, and not one that necessarily any of them would be able to achieve, in which case what happens? It's 11:15. Who do you want to be the next leader of the Tory party and why? 0345 6060 973. And remember, on this programme, the why is more important than the who. I always sort of guard against apocalypticism, if that's a word. I mean, the Labour Party looked to be in existential danger after the 2019 election. Half of them were running around claiming that they'd won the argument, while the other half were despairing at ever being able to turn around Boris Johnson's enormous majority. I think that the scale of Keir Starmer's achievement is highlighted by that Hartlepool by-election result in 2021, which saw calls for him to resign, for him to give up his crack at being leader of the Labour Party. And look where we are just 3 long years later. I didn't entertain this thought in my earlier introduction, but I think perhaps I should have done. I mean, could the Tory party be staring into the abyss? I think that the first past the post system saves them really from further fragmentation on the right. But this result, arithmetically in Parliament, is so bad. The difficulty that we have in identifying anything from the last 8 years that could be remotely described as a success or an achievement, the legacy that we're going to be living with for some time. I mean, Tory parties Conservative parties can wither and die. Political parties can wither and die. You know, the old Liberal Party, the Whigs, essentially done for by the rise of the trade union movement and morphing into Labour. So, I mean, could we be, or is it far too early to ask this question? Could we be looking at the sort of end of the Conservative Party? I don't think so. And for the time being, at least, I hope not. Charlie's in Edinburgh. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Yeah, very interesting debate. Just to put my cards on the table, I was a member of the Conservative Party, but I'm very much a Conservative with a small c, and yes. I didn't vote Conservative last time round because I couldn't bring myself to tie my flag to the same mast as any of these lunatics that were in charge of the asylum. But I think that the issue that they've got is, and it's been mentioned a fair bit, is effectively they've got two choices in a way, haven't they? They either veer to the sort of right of the party, and there's a lot of people sort of kind of banging on about the fact that they've got to shore up the vote, the people that move to reform. Well, what about the people like myself that couldn't vote for the Tory party and actually voted Liberal Democrat or even possibly Labour? And the other question I've got, and I think it's an important one, is the fact that if you look at the demographic of the, shall we say, the more right-wing type of voter, the reform voter, dare I say it, they may be slightly longer in the tooth than many of the others. And if they do lurch to the right, and you've mentioned this already, are they not basically slowly committing suicide? And I think there is a tendency just to focus on the right hand of the party and the right side and reform. But I think there needs to be more of an informed debate. And unfortunately, dare I say it, when you have the likes of Miss Braverman and all the likes involved in that, are they going to have a sensible debate about this? And in answer to that, I really think they need to have a debate because there is an existential threat to the party, and we do need to have in this country some form of sensible
even at committee level, you know, even if just in staffing the select committees with experienced and competent people, you want to have a Conservative Party with a substantial base. I think we need to review some of the language slightly, don't we? Because when we say lurch to the right or rush to the right, we're really being a little bit euphemistic, I think. What we're describing is the idea of Tory candidates who've spent the last God knows how long whining endlessly about immigration, thinking that the path to power would be turning up the volume on their endless whining about immigration, but now doing it from a position of opposition rather than from a position of power. They had 13 years to get on top of things, and they signally failed to do so. So how anybody associated with the previous 3 or 4 governments thinks that the public can be won over with promises to be even more performatively cruel about immigration or asylum is, I think it might be insane.
Well, I wouldn't disagree. And I think what's really interesting, and you touched on this earlier, is the reduction of the power of the press. Yes. And you've got a situation where the Labour Party, rightly so, I think, don't actually necessarily need to care too much about this. And I'm sure the likes of Paul Darker, or whatever his name is, at the Daily Mail are probably hopping up and down and tearing their hair out, and they're absolutely livid about this. But maybe the Tory party should take a leaf out of this book and say, well, do you know what? If we do listen to these type of individuals and shift that way, then maybe we are seeing the slow decline towards their sort of kind of eventual disappearance. Whereas maybe, let's take a leaf out of their book, maybe we shouldn't concentrate so much on this. Maybe let's take a step back. Why don't we have a sensible conversation about this?
That's what I do.
And I just think if you involve some of these, the sort of kind of bigger names in the party who we know which way they are leaning.
Yeah.
I don't think they will have that debate. And I think the result of that might well be the end of the Tory party as we know.
Do you know what I'm hearing as you speak? I'm hearing an abandonment of the sensible. I think you'd see yourself as sensible, Charlie. I
would hope so, yes.
You probably have friends who disagree, but I think we'll allow that label to dangle around your neck. I am a sensible, small c Conservative. And at the moment, as this leadership race shapes up, they seem to be embarking upon a mad pursuit of the insensible vote.
Completely. I would completely agree with that. And I think hopefully
that's bad for everyone, right? That's bad for everyone.
But it is bad for everyone because you do need to have, in the British parliamentary system, we need to have people who are going to take a look at government policy and actually we need to have a... my brain's gone completely dead.
That's all right.
People opposite who sit in the opposite.
Opposition.
That's the one.
Happens to us all.
Here's someone who studied politics at university.
It's not as easy as I make it look, this job, Charlie. I'll tell you that for nothing.
But we do need to have an opposition. And if you have one that is completely fragmented, who's fighting amongst themselves and again, I don't think that is good for the country. I really don't.
No, I don't know. I had a little period during the just before the election campaign kicked off in earnest, actually, of wondering whether we were spending too much time worrying about that. But you just need to understand how Parliament works to recognise the importance of having competent and decently sized opposition in place. 80, 200, however big the majority is, you still want people who are decent on the other side of the bench. And that tension between the sensible Tory and the insensible Tory, who is essentially a UKIP voter, that more or less the same size of the vote as happened in 2015. And, you could argue that without the madness of Brexit, that conversation would have had to have been had sooner. So Johnson's desperate Brexit done campaigning in 2019, which at the time you could have been forgiven for falling for. I don't think you could be forgiven for falling for it now. Just postponed this existential threat coming from the further right. I just can't see how the Tories' path to relevance or return to contention is going to involve trying to take on the professional racists at racism. I just can't see that. But hey, I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again. 25 minutes after 11 is the time. From Edinburgh to Trowbridge in Wiltshire. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
You're enjoying yourself today, aren't you?
I enjoy myself every day, Andrew.
That's what I like to hear. I've got an odd one for you.
Come on.
I think this is the ideal time for people who want to rejoin the union to join the Tory party.
Oh, go on then.
Well, they seem to have lost the will to do anything except win at any cost. I expect if you persuaded them that they could win by rejoining the EU, they'd go for it.
Not this time round. I think it's a fascinating gambit, and I don't think it's impossible that the Conservatives start talking about rejoining the single market before the Labour Party do. I really don't think it's impossible. But it is impossible if they go down the direction that we've just been discussing, the sort of lurching ever further towards the nativist snarls, as opposed to trying to return to the sensible. Because if the closer you are to the sensible, the more inevitable it becomes that you start talking about rejoining the single market soon. And Starmer appears to have boxed that off as an option, which is interesting.
Well, I mean, this is my point. Now's the time to actually start pushing for it.
Not now. They can't do it now. Look at these leaders.
If you're a member of the
Braverman,
Tory
Patel.
party,
What?
and there's enough of them, they can.
But I mean, the Parliamentary Conservative Party isn't even ready to do that yet. So anyway, I forgot to ask the last chap. I shall ask you, who do you like the look of? Because I don't think any of the current contenders are going to do what you are suggesting. But out of all of the people whose hats are either in the ring or hovering above the ring, who do you like the look of, and why?
To be honest, I don't think any of them will last very long.
No.
None of them are going to be a decent referee, and the fight is... Well, looking at their personality profiles, I would say they weren't going to be nice about it.
No, I mean, it's going to be another circular firing squad, but given that they're not in power anymore, it'll be a little bit more enjoyable than the previous circular firing squads. The problem with the previous circular firing squads, of course, was that every time you enjoyed a little bit of schadenfreude at these people tearing each other to shreds, you were reminded that they were still in charge of the country and still embarked upon a programme of tearing the country to shreds. And I guess, spelling out where they think the last campaign went wrong gives you a fairly clear idea of where they are likely to want to lead it. So Braverman wrote, "We need to face facts. We failed in office and deserved this result." I mean, how much responsibility for what happened can you try to absolve yourself of? Home Secretary 2, 3 separate occasions? And trying to say, nothing to do with me, Gov. It's like the government of Shaggy, isn't it? It wasn't me. Cameron's an interesting character, just in the context of what the Tories might do next. Because Cameron was largely unknown. He was a very fresh face, very new. He was expected, in the first instance, to lose to David Davis. People forget that. And it was, historically, or the mythology is that there was a single superb conference speech that changed the arithmetic of voting intentions and saw Cameron installed as leader. That's a little bit glib. What actually happened was that Michael Howard charged himself, having led the party to defeat, he charged himself with ensuring a transfer of power to the new generation. And you had people like Cameron and George Osborne front of house, and then behind the scenes you had people like Danny, now Lord Finkelstein. Gove as well, very much part of that generation, albeit that he was working as a journalist at the time. You had that determination from Michael Howard to set the party on a new course, a course that ultimately saw them take power in 2010, quite unexpectedly. And I don't see that happening. I don't know who those candidates would even be. How many people knew David Cameron's name in 2015? I don't know the answer to that question, but nowhere near as many as know the names of Priti Patel or Suella Braverman. Is there what they call a clean skin lurking on the Tory backbenches? I very much doubt it, but it's a mark perhaps of how deep their problems run. Thank you, Andrew. It's 11:30. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I suppose I should remind you, you're perfectly entitled to ring me and tell me that you can't quite believe the paucity of the offer, the shallowness of the talent puddle from which the Tories will seek to select their next leader. Honest Bob Jenrick, Suella Braverman, Victoria Atkins and Priti Patel. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It is 11:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, I mean, looking at some of the messages that you're sending in, I'm not even sure that there's any relish for a Tory party leadership campaign from self-described Tories. I don't know what the calendar will look like. I know that Sunak is willing to stay on to ensure an orderly transition, but he's not going to do what Michael Howard did and seek to influence what the future looks like. I think of all the observations that we made in the course of that election campaign, the very first one is going to prove to be the most pertinent. The mystery of why he called the election so early probably had more to do with his desire just to get it over and done with than almost anything else. People talk about knowing that Rwanda wouldn't work or knowing that the small boats would start crossing the channel again. Small boats turned into a political issue by right-wing politicians, by Farage and the Tories. Weird. I think you end up creating the political issues that do for your own campaigns. But the idea that this is going to be an interesting conversation for us hasn't quite landed yet, has it? Because A, we're focusing on the new government, and B, it feels very deja vu, very Groundhog Day to be having conversations about the relative awfulness of Braverman, Jenrick, Patel, and I suppose that the least known of this bunch, Victoria Atkins, or surely Tom Tugendhat's attempt. He sent a rather splendid message to Dan Jarvis. I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, recognising that some issues transcend politics, and Dan Jarvis replacing Tom Tugendhat with a security brief. And it was a really powerful picture, actually, of them both, I think, on active military service together, posing together for the camera. And it was a nice reminder of what politics can look like, what it can be like. But I do worry, I've said this before, that Tugendhat's credentials as the sensible contender, he might be the most sensible of this bunch, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's very sensible at all. 11:34 is the time. We're going to talk a little about the French election in the next section of the programme, so don't miss that. That was an unexpected result, I think it's fair to say, judging by much of the coverage on this side of the channel of where Marine Le Pen and her party were going. But it is the right wing here who concern us for now. What do you think they are going to do, and what would you like them to do? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Mark's in Chesterfield. Mark, what do you reckon?
Morning, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
I think it's time, James, the Conservative Party either accept that they're, this extreme right-wing party and a lot of their, members and followers switch over to reform, or they, get some adults back in the room and realise that, where the strength in the, getting actually re-elected is, the central ground, and start appealing to people like that. I know they had their, purge in 2019 of all the, kind of sensible characters, your Rory Stewarts, people who, actually had a bit of common sense and weren't part of the Boris Johnson,
that is a element of recent political history that is never going to fade into the background, isn't it? And certainly not in the foreseeable future, because understanding how they're in such a mess now, it's intrinsic to understanding that, to remember what Cummings and Johnson did in 2019.
No, 100%. And I think, like I say, a lot of their core has probably switched to reform and aren't coming back. So maybe they just need to,
just cut them loose and focus on what's left. Because reform got roughly the same numbers, not in terms of MPs, but in terms of votes. I think they came second in more constituencies in 2015 than they did this time round. So there could be an argument for treating the extreme right in the same way that Keir Starmer treated the extreme left. Just saying you're no longer part of my contemplations or considerations.
Oh, no, 100%. And I think a lot of kind of Labour voters in the last election will probably, vote for a rebranded Conservative Party or, a completely new party, in that kind of middle ground.
Could be tempted back.
Tempted back, or, just don't agree with, everything that Labour are saying, don't agree with everything that Tories are saying, but actually there's a middle ground there for someone to say, actually, I believe in this, I believe in this.
Who's not tarnished? I mean, Atkins is an ally of Sunak. Jenrick's talking about tax. The public, no one ever really wants to pay much more tax themselves, but when they're speaking objectively, the public recognises the need for more spending on public services in this country at the moment, which is very, very hard to do if you're cutting the amount of money coming into the Treasury. No one's really come out for anyone yet. But I shall ask you the same question I've asked previous callers. Does anyone tickle your fancy from the current slate?
Well, like if I say touched on it, I think the only sensible one in the previous cabinet was probably Tom Tugendhat. But again, he's worked for Rishi Sunak and probably got some of the views of the Brailmans, and
I don't know. I mean, he hasn't done enough to distance himself from what has gone before, and there it is. Actually, that's the phrase you've reminded me of, Mark. Is that either they desperately don't distance themselves from what has gone before, they double down on what has gone before, or they seek to create some form of fresh start. And there is only one candidate on this list who could realistically claim to represent a fresh start. But as you say, he's served in previous governments. 121 MPs they've got, and strategists for a number of potential candidates, will now be looking at the records of those MPs to try to get a clearer picture of what type of party the Parliamentary Conservative Party is. One strategist has told The Guardian it's not a Faragist party. Anyone who pursues that will lose. And yet there's one columnist in the Daily Mail today saying their only chance of survival or success moving forward would be to seek to cannibalise the people drawn to the Reform UK Limited. And I guess this is one of those occasions where the hardest thing for commentators to say is, I haven't got a Scooby-Doo, actually, what is going to happen or what would work best. But I can't believe personally that tripling down on all of the nastiness that has gone before is the way to somehow get a different result. Finley's in Northampton. Finley, what would you like to say?
James, I'd just like to say, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you on this
lovely thing to say. Thank you.
Mediocre day.
On this mediocre day, carry on.
It's kind of grim over here. Yes. But I just wanted to say actually, that a lot of the discussion I think around who's going to be leading the Tory party in the next few years seems to be dedicated. Who's currently available and, what options are there within the current setup. But yes. I think that quite clearly from the election and I mean, I'm no statistician, but I think that looking at the available numbers, we had quite a low voter turnout.
Yes.
Quite a large amount of people, in the shires, as so many people have been referring to it this morning, have gone and voted for Lib Dems.
Yes.
And I think that, the thing that's quite clear actually is that the Tories, when they won with Cameron, were mainly in the centre. They won over the moderates who, would otherwise have voted whatever the middle option would have been. Labour in the 90s and then obviously we off the back of, economic failure with the banks in 2008 and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that, it was voter apathy for Labour, at a time where there had been an economic downturn in 2008 that rode along a moderate Tory party. And then they've swung further right, I think, probably as a response to, Trumpism and, the way that things have been going internationally. And I think a lot of people have really heard the media rhetoric, and that's dragged right-wing parties further to the right. But I think in the UK, I don't think there's really an appetite for it,
Well, it doesn't ever really go much higher than 15%. I always say there's a potential 15 to 20% there, but we could. I mean, you're right until you're wrong. That was true. It was true in France until relatively recently. It's still true for the AfD in Germany. So that idea of trying to cannibalise further to the right, though, just seems, as you say, arithmetically questionable. How much? How realistic do you think it is that they are in a sort of in a genuinely existential danger now? That because we're really struggling to see what the path back looks like. Could we have done this in 2019, talking about Keir Starmer? Could we have said it's really clear what he needs to do? He could be the next Prime Minister if he does A, B and C. Can we do that about the Tories now?
I think the problem is that when you're talking about the 2019 general election, I think that the main ticket policy was going to be based upon leaving the EU.
It was so Brexity, wasn't it? It was the second referendum, really, the 2019 election, but without any real option to vote to remain.
Well, of course, and I think that what we saw really with Boris Johnson's Parliament and and basically the proroguing of government and all of this kind of stuff is that we were kind of willing to throw reason to the wind in favour of the Brexit lie that most people have accepted that has been sold. And I think that the real shame of British politics as it is now is that the fight has pretty much come
I'm going to point something out, Finlay.
Yes.
You and the previous caller both suffer from itis. And I don't notice it very often, but I think as we got two calls in very quick succession in which we've heard probably more than we have in the previous 6 months in the space of two calls. I don't know why I'm pointing it out. It's probably desperately unfair and I probably sound like a bully. But I am pointing it out.
That's fine. I mean, my manager at work always says, your problem is you always say, well, the problem is. And that is true. I'm always generally pretty.
The producer is trolling me. The producer is saying I say it as well. I say it sometimes. I don't say it noticeably. So I say extraordinary a little bit too much. But of
course.
But there it is. So I mean, none of us know. Actually, we may have gone a bit early on this phone-in because nobody has really got a very strong answer to any of the questions that I'm asking, except the recognition that the dichotomy, the choice, is between going after Farage's lot or trying to return to reality, trying to return to some semblance of sensibleness.
Well, I think personally, if I had to draw down some of the things, especially, looking recently,
3.
Sorry, looking recently at policies that have happened over the course of this election.
Yes,
the Tories have essentially shot themselves in the foot with a series of policies.
But then they're saying,
but
then they're saying we need more of that. Which they don't seem to have anything in their locker except we need to reduce taxes and reduce immigration. And I wonder whether actually the very simple fact that they're all heavily associated with what has gone before. Jenrick was probably being the most ambitious when he resigned. I can't even remember what element of the Rwanda nonsense it was that Honest Bob decided to resign over, but he managed to get himself out of the public eye not long after becoming infamous for ordering the painting over of murals designed to comfort some of the most traumatised children on the planet. He's back there. vying for the big job by making all the same noises that he would have made before he resigned from his last job. That's going to be very interesting, whether or not the next successful Tory leader will be one or two further down the road. We're going to have an Ian Duncan Smith and a Michael Howard. Yeah, that's it, isn't it? We're probably going to have an Ian Duncan Smith and a Michael Howard. We'll probably have a William Hague, an Ian Duncan Smith and a Michael Howard before we get a David Cameron. I don't know whether that's an uplifting thought or a cheering thought or a depressing thought. I suppose it depends partly on what you think about those four men and what you think about the prospects of Labour government. It's 11:45. It is 11:47. Quite a few of you pointing out that the Conservatives' Twitter account appears to have disappeared, which possibly provides an answer to the question we've been pondering of just how existential the threat to their future may currently be. But we turn our attention next, as promised, to events this weekend in France, which I think it's fair to say are even more, considerably more chaotic than the domestic political landscape. The far-right party of Marine Le Pen widely expected to win, ended up coming third. Sophie Pedder is the bureau chief in Paris for The Economist, and she joins me now. I wonder if you could just bring us up to speed first, Sophie, with what's happened, overnight and this morning.
Well, overnight, the results were confirmed. As you just said, Marine Le Pen's party came in third place. She's still got a big block of seats in the National Assembly. So, she's not a fringe phenomenon, but she didn't come top, which everyone was pretty much expecting her to do. Instead, we've got the left-wing alliance at the top, and we've got Macron Centre, which held on to quite a lot of seats and makes him his group the second biggest. So that's the look of the National Assembly.
What are you most surprised by?
We've also had this morning.
Sorry, carry on.
Oh, well, I was just going to tell you this morning we've had the resignation of the Prime Minister. Now, that's a kind of technical event in a way because he went to the Élysée Palace, he presented his resignation to the President. The President has asked him to stay on, effectively in a kind of caretaker role. There's a feeling here that we are days, if not weeks, away from seeing a next government, and therefore he's going to be occupying that job, but not actually passing any legislation, obviously.
What were you most surprised by out of those three results for those three groupings?
I think the order, that was what struck me, and I think a lot of people. I mean, you should have seen the faces on of Marine Le Pen's deputies when they saw the results coming through. They were really taken aback. This was a party, don't forget, that thought it was about to govern. They thought they'd come top. They did come top in the first round. France has this 2-round voting system, and so in the first round they absolutely scooped up first round positions across the country. And they were ready. They were talking about who they would nominate as their finance minister, who they put in the foreign ministry. This was the kind of conversations they were having. And then suddenly they came in third place. That was a shock to them, a relief to others. And then the left-wing alliance doing incredibly well. I mean, I think it's the order of the results that's taken everybody by surprise.
Important to understand a little more about the French electoral system. So the second round differs from the first round in that the choice is reduced, and even more reduced this time than ever before because of some of the deals that were done before the ballots opened.
That's exactly right. So you have this two-round system. There's 577 constituencies, and it's effectively in the second round, it's a first past the post. But in order to get to the second round, you can be elected, actually, in the first round. If you get over 50% of the vote. Marine Le Pen, she was elected. She got 58% up in the north of France. So she was elected outright. A number of people were. But then if you get over a threshold, you go on to the second round. And what happened there, and what often happens is that you have 3 qualifiers. But that in between the 2 rounds, there are kind of tactical deals done between parties. And in this case, the deals were done between the centrist, Macron's centrist movement, and the left-wing alliance. And the point of all of that is to stop the vote being split, the anti-far-right vote being split. So whoever came third in the qualifier, in other words, was sort of invited, expected, kind of ordered to stand down. And in some cases, that was really complicated. I mean, we had a couple of people from government who made it into the second round in their constituencies, and Macron actually had to literally, ask them, please, can you now step down? You're in third place. we got to let the left wing go through to take on the far right. So you can see how irritating and actually this makes for the far right. This is they feel like the choice wasn't really put before the voters, but it was a very effective way of stopping the far right from getting a majority.
So not unlike our experiences over here, this is more about rejection than it is about support.
I think so. I mean, in a way, I sort of see these two rounds as you could almost sum it up as kind of two little referendums. The first referendum was on Macron, and people absolutely rejected him. There's no doubt about that. The vote massively heavily for the far right. But the second one was almost like a little mini referendum on the far right. And this time it was, well, we don't like Macron, but we don't like the far right either. And so we've ended up with this hung parliament, which is what it is, with no majority, no single bloc dominating. And that's kind of a good reflection of the country. It's a very divided France.
How left-wing is the left-wing grouping?
It depends who you ask.
Right.
It's an incredibly broad coalition, which goes from the sort of, I suppose the best comparison for the UK would be a kind of Corbynist left. That's under this leader called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was once upon a time a Trotskyist and is an absolute kind of radical. And it goes all the way to the very moderate left, the Socialist Party. There's a character called Raphael Glucksmann, who is, honestly, he could be sitting in Macron's party. I mean, he wouldn't like me for saying that, but he could. And Greens as well. So it is an incredibly broad church. They disagree on almost everything from sort of NATO to arming Ukraine to nuclear power. I mean, it's almost a miracle that they managed to put together this alliance, which they did, and it stuck for the election. But
because they agreed on the importance of keeping Le Pen's lot out. Would that be pretty much the only thing that they agreed on?
Yes, but I would say more than that. I would say that they saw this as a chance for them to become a player again. I mean, don't forget that Macron's project over the last 7 years in France has pretty much been to crush the left and crush the right. And that's been very bruising, especially for a party like the Socialist Party, which was just performed so poorly. And then suddenly they sensed in the after the European elections, which were on June the 9th, they sensed this kind of wind in their sails, and they really didn't want to let that go. So they saw a chance of them becoming a kind of major player again in French politics, and that overrode all the differences between them, and they managed to stitch this alliance together very fast.
Thank you, Sophie. Finally, where does this leave Macron, and where does it leave his gamble? Because you could read it as having paid off a bit, because the far right, the National Rally, are not providing the next prime minister, but equally everything looks very messy.
I think that sums it up. I mean, he in one respect, he's kept out the far right, and that in that sense, his bet has paid off. But he has certainly not emerged stronger as a result of this. The centre hasn't collapsed, but he has lost a lot of deputies, about roughly 100 deputies. So that's not a good result for him. But his party, his bloc in the centre, remains a player in all of this. And given that no one has a majority, it actually puts them in a position potentially to be the kind of kingmaker movement, which could determine whether or not there is a majority government in the future. So it depends how you look and how you measure his gamble, but it certainly isn't a disaster that some people saw it as being when he first called that snap election.
And when do you think there'll be a government, like a fully functioning French government in place?
How about after the Olympic Games? I think that the feeling here, the Olympic Games starts on July the 26th. Yeah. I mean, that's really close. The idea of having a kind of unstable, chaotic situation doesn't really appeal to many people. So it's possible that the caretaker government will just continue not doing anything, just signing the checks, keeping government ticking over, not doing any legislation, just to give France a bit of stability during the Olympics. After that, I think all bets are off.
Oh, happy days. Sophie, thank you so much. Sophie Pedder, the Paris bureau chief for The Economist, doing an absolutely brilliant job of talking us through some of the political chaos engulfing the French at the moment. Speaking of the Olympics, I must give a shout out to one of our athletes called Georgia Bell, who's qualified for the 1,500 metres and shaved 4 seconds off her personal best last night, and who 18 months ago had given up sport completely. She'd given up the sport completely. And the reason why I want to give her a shout is that her mum was my daughter's PE teacher. And her dad was an old pal of mine from Channel 5 News, Andy Bell. So it's a great story, that, if you're not familiar with it already. She was watching the last Olympics and recognising some people that she used to compete against when she was much younger. I think she's 30 now. And thinking, oh, maybe. So during lockdown, she just started running again, more for mental health, and suddenly realised she was still pretty blooming good at this. And now she's going to the actual Olympic Games. It's a magical story. Back to a contest rather closer to home. The final word on the imminent Tory leadership election. We'll go to Isaac, who's in Heston. Isaac, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. First time caller to you.
Welcome.
Okay.
Yes.
And congratulations on your book ranking high in Amazon.
Well, thank you very much.
Ebook and audio book, so I'll read through them. Anyway.
Yes.
Anyway, love your books. Now, I've got two candidates for the Tory party leadership. Okay. Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch. Now, why? I'll tell you why. Because if either of those two become leader, okay, in 5 years' time, in 2029, the Tories are guaranteed another electoral spanking. So bring it on.
Well, don't forget that Ian Duncan Smith never fought a general election. I know he sort of casts himself now as a sort of grandee or as an elder statesman, which is possibly a mark of how mad that party is at the moment. But he never fought a general election because the old Tories were ruthless. And they could get rid of a leader without allowing them the chance of actually fighting a general election. Labour historically have perhaps had the opposite problem, letting people fight two losing campaigns. So whoever they choose now, it is not guaranteed, Isaac, that person, whoever it may be, will in fact lead them into the next general election. If their polling goes even further off the cliff than it has already, then the men in grey suits will possibly move to replace the leader before they go into the next general election. Michael Howard, widely considered to have done a hell of a lot better than Ian Duncan Smith would have done. And crucially, as I've explained already today, Michael Howard really took it upon himself to ensure not just a peaceful transition of power, but to actually play a key role in what the Tory party was going to look like after he stepped down as leader following that crunching defeat that he faced. But I like it. I like your thinking. The worse the leader, the better it is for the other lot. I've got two things for you next. It's either three. Electoral reform, ID cards, or the 4-day week. Go on, have a quick vote by text. It's 3 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of a 4-day week is one that I don't know that we've ever talked about it before. Have we ever talked about it before? I feel it in the same space that I feel universal basic income. Does that make sense to you? I just the idea of something that is revolutionary and therefore quite shocking at first. We don't like change as a species. There's been so much development in my part of London lately. And I understand why people who worry that their own children won't be able to stay in an area because it's become gentrified would be unhappy with the gentrification. But some of it is mad. Some of the objections on the local community forums are actually bonkers. We now have a bookshop in Brentford, Hewson Books, a splendid bookshop that's open in Brentford, the same people that run the bookshop in Kew. And when it was announced on one of the community websites that we're getting a bookshop in Brentford, someone replied, "We've already got a bookshop. It's called The Library." And you just think, mate, how grumpy do you have to be objecting to an obvious improvement to your community? You will now be able to go out and buy books without having to get on a bus to Chiswick. It is just it's an improvement. It is something that is better than what was there before. But some people just can't quite process this. It must be an evolutionary thing. How easy is it to completely divide the population according to how they respond to change? See, I would, in my own mind, chalk myself up as someone who doesn't like change very much, but I do. I wondered whether the lockdowns and the furloughs would change our social psychology, would actually change the way we think about things. You'd recognise that you can do things very differently. And you know what? They have. The furlough has changed something quite significantly. Working from home now is an entirely ordinary thing, whereas previously, or flexi working more obviously, previously, if somebody told you they worked from home, you thought there was something a little bit weird going on, or a little bit sus, or maybe they didn't have a job at all. They were just like one of those people that you used to hear about who'd get up and pack their briefcase every day and then go and sit in the park because they couldn't bring themselves to tell their partner that they'd been binned. But working from home, despite the best efforts of some of the usual suspects, has just become completely normal. Completely normal. In fact, so many people now engage in flexible working practices that some research this morning suggests that 6 million people are going to be working from the beach this summer because they are now able to work from anywhere. They can go on holiday without actually taking any time off. They'll log on from overseas for at least some of the year. It's about half of these employees plan to use these rights either to work while on holiday or extend their time overseas by working for part of their trip. There's another thing I noticed yesterday when I was wandering around the new developments near us, is that there's a hub. So there's like an apartment blocks, but there's a club for people who've bought a flat there to work in, like a kind of workspace. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, isn't it? A workspace, but it's part of an apartment block. I mean, that would not have happened 10 years ago, would it? You wouldn't, if you were building a new apartment block, you wouldn't have put in a space downstairs where the residents could work, as if that were the most normal thing in the world. You just wouldn't have done it, right? So what I'm pointing out to you is that actually sometimes we do absorb revolutionary change really easy. What's your favourite? Smoking ban. Smoking ban? Or seatbelts in cars? There was genuine resistance to this stuff before it came in, but within hours of it coming in, it felt like the new normal. And I think working from home falls into that category as well. I should start with a conversation about the 4-day week by reflecting upon how furious the Tories were when a Liberal Democrat council decided to experiment with it. It's the largest ever public sector trial of a 4-day week in Britain. The Tories responded by shouting at the council leader to, quote, end your experiment immediately, when the Conservative MP in the relevant area described it as an ideological crusade. And he got beaten by the Liberal Democrat councillor, the Liberal Democrat candidate last week in the same spot. So there are two stories in the news today that almost cancel each other out, which is why I think this might work as a phone-in. I mean, that and the fact that you voted for it much more than you did for either ID cards or electoral reform, both of which we will talk about at some point in the not too distant future. But today we'll talk about this. It's a slightly more upbeat conversation potentially, because the other story is about Asda abandoning the 4-day week, but I think I've lost that story, so I'm going to have to do it from memory. So Asda has experimented with a 4-day week, and it hasn't gone very well because everyone's so knackered. So they were sort of doing 4 11-hour shifts as opposed to 5 slightly shorter shifts, and they have abandoned the plan now because everyone was absolutely shattered. Doing the 4 11-hour shifts took it out of people in a way that doing the 5 shorter shifts did not. The council experiment in South Cambridgeshire is of a different order entirely, because they seem to have reduced the total number of hours. And what has happened, and hold on to your hats for this one, is that it has resulted in performance improvements in 11 out of 24 areas, little or no change in 11 areas, and things have got worse in 2 areas, although one of those could be down to the cost of living crisis because it was the levels of rent being collected for the council. That went down slightly, but that could just as easily be because people were poorer than they were in previous years. So the experiment with the 4-day week would appear to have been a resounding success. Staff turnover fell by 39%, which meant they saved an estimated £371,500 on agency staff costs. Household planning applications were decided on average a week and a half earlier. 15% more major planning decisions were completed within the correct time scale, and the time taken to process changes to housing benefit and council tax benefit claims actually fell. Now, off the top of my head, I can't work out why that would be. Why would things actually get better when there is a 4-day week? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I don't quite understand it. Staff were expected to carry out 100% of their work in 80% of the time for 100% of the pay. The study also found that the scores for employees' physical and mental health, motivation and commitment had all improved during the trial. So, at first glance, it would seem to me that this is close to being a no-brainer. But what they've done is very different from what Asda did, you see. So Asda essentially said you can have a 4-day week, but you're going to do the same number of hours across 4 days that you previously did across 5 days. And what South Cambridgeshire Council have done is say you're going to do the same amount of work across 4 days that you previously did about 5 days. And you're going to do that by working harder or to use that dreadful phrase, working smarter. So, what do we think? You know what my first worry is on this? Phone lines are open, by the way. This is one of those subjects where you almost certainly know more about it as I do. 0345 6060 973. Yes, you're quite right. Slightly shorter shifts was probably a bit of a risky phrase to roll out on the radio on a Monday, but I think I got away with it. But why does it work? Is the question that I want to ask. I can see why the Asda plan didn't work. Getting people to work 44 hours over 4 days instead of over 5 days for the same salary has not worked because it's just too exhausting. But getting people to get the same salary and the same workload but spread it across 4 days instead of 5 days, why would that work? Because you'd worry, wouldn't you, that once it has been established that it works, you go back to the 5-day week and expect people to do 120% of the workload that they were doing previously. So if you've got 20% of your workload spread across 5 days, and then you go to a 4-day week and you're doing 25% of your workload on each one of those days, if I was a Victorian mill owner, I'd ask, why couldn't you be doing 25% of your workload on all 5 days so that your workload then becomes 125% of what it was before? I'm making sense, yes? I'm not very good with numbers, as you may have noticed over the years. I'll explain it again for the benefit of the hard of thinking, all right? There are 5 days in a week, and there is 100% workload. That is what you know your workload is. Here is 100% of your workload, and you're currently doing 5 days. Now, in South Cambridgeshire, they have discovered that by telling people that their workload will stay the same, but they have to do it over 4 days, it has been a great success. So your daily work now contains 25% of your overall workload for the week. You are doing 25% across 4 days, and 25 times 4 is 100%. So if I were a Victorian mill owner, I would come back now and say, hang on a minute, why couldn't you do 25% of your workload every day when you were on a 5-day week? And then you'd be doing 125% of your workload on a 5-day week, and that would be better than the 4-day week. Yes, except for one little thing that may be at the very heart of this entire conversation, and that is prioritising the health and the happiness of the workforce over blind statistical productivity. So, I have no experience of this whatsoever. In fact, quite a few of you have pointed out, Phil perhaps most rudely. He says, 4-day week, please, James, for the next conversation, which I know is more than you do in a calendar month. I come to work every day, Phil. And sometimes I stay until 2 o'clock. I'm doing a podcast today. I'll be here till 3. That's practically, it's like going down a coal mine, mate, honestly. I want you to tell me why you think it works. 0345 6060 973. Why does moving to a 4-day week see an actual improvement in productivity? Not to mention a much happier workforce. That's probably the easiest bit to work out. But they involved 450 desk staff and the refuse collectors. And one of the key elements of it was that fewer refuse collectors quit. So sometimes they had to fill holes in the refuse collection crew by using agency staff, which is more expensive than using traditional staff or staff, not least because the agency takes a cut. And so that is part of the reason why they managed to save just shy of £400,000. But why does it work? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I don't want to call you rude names, but if you want to rain on this parade, you are welcome to. But you have to rain on it from an evidenced position. So you've got these knee-jerk Tories saying, cancel your experiment immediately. And you've got the now unelected or the now defeated local Conservative describing it as an ideological crusade. The research would seem to show that it's worked a treat, but I don't know that that necessarily means it would work a treat forever moving forward. Would we not slide back to, well, but we need to answer the question of why it's produced the goods. Why has this council reduced the amount of days that its staff work and seen an improvement in the amount of work and the quality of the work that they do? And it kind of flies in the face of almost everything that Tory tradition would hold dear, doesn't it? Why do you think it's happened? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. It's 17 minutes after 12 and some almost unbearable news for you from Kyiv, where Russia has bombed a children's hospital. I'm looking at some footage from the scene, and it is, I mean, it's as I say, I'm not going to improve upon the word unbearable. Doctors covered in blood, volunteers assisting the ongoing rescue efforts at the children's hospital in Kyiv after it was apparently targeted by Russian missiles. If you follow Oz Chatterjee, who's often helped us out with reports from Ukraine since Putin's invasion, you'll be able to keep across what is happening there now. But that has just happened in the last 2 hours. If you're just joining us, extraordinary, heartbreaking scenes from Kyiv, where we know 4 people have been killed, 3 others injured as a result of the Russian second shelling, according to the state emergency services of Ukraine. And this one appears to be a children's hospital. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. Back to the domestic political scene and the success in South Cambridgeshire of a trial by the Liberal Democrat-controlled authority with a 4-day week for staff, which appears by most available measures to have been a resounding success. Why? And if you've got experience of this, front of the queue time. Frank's in Carlisle. Frank, what do you reckon?
Hi, James. I think it's basically, if people are happier, they work better. I mean, there's been I remember people talking about saying that productivity in the UK is really low compared to some other countries.
Yes.
And if people are happier in their work, they will work better. And so if you've got a 3-day weekend, you know, that would make me happy, having a 3-day weekend.
How long for? How long would it make you happy? How long do you reckon it would be before you really fancied a 4-day weekend?
Well, I think that's taking the mick, really, isn't it?
Why? What's the difference? It's only one more day. You've just taken one, because you'd wake up on Tuesday morning and it would now feel like Monday morning. Or do you think we would actually have a different feeling, a different vibe? We'd have more pep if we actually had 3 days off to do our own thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've got friends who work as teachers, and they're not getting paid 5 days and working 4. They're just working 4 days.
Right.
But if they get a 3-day weekend, that's great. Or sometimes they get like a Wednesday off, where they have a mini weekend. I've got some friends who call it their baby weekend on a Wednesday.
Oh, that's
and then
nice.
you have a proper weekend on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah. So it's a bit, I mean, it's post-Victorian, this idea that productivity equals hours. It clearly doesn't.
I'm not making pins here.
No, exactly that. And in fact, this kind of work, doing planning applications, and it just means that you're approaching everything in 4th or 5th gear and you never really slip down into 3rd because you're much more on it. You're much more upbeat.
Yeah. I mean, I work in IT for the NHS on their education systems, and we have flexible hours to the extent that if I needed to do something, not like going to the doctors where you get time off for that, but if I needed to do something like take my car to get its MOT or something like that, then I can stick a couple of extra hours on the end of Tuesday and work them, and then take a couple of hours on Wednesday to go and do that.
Also,
and that level of flexibility just makes life so much better, and I'm convinced it's made me more productive.
Well, also you feel more respected, because I mean the jobs that I've hated the most have been the ones that are most closely policed. And I mean, I'm going, it's ancient history now, but when I worked in retail, I know that I sold more suits when I had a manager who gave me quite a lot of freedom than I did when I had a manager who used to, make us fold jumpers if there were no customers in the shop, even though we'd already folded them that morning. We had to unfold them and then fold them again, and it just creates a sort of subconscious grievance, doesn't it?
Yeah, before I worked for the NHS, I worked in retail, in IT again, and I had a manager there who, if he saw you sort of sitting, having a think about what you were doing in your programming, he'd sort of look at you and say, well, go sweep up the warehouse if you're not doing anything, because your fingers aren't pressing buttons right now.
Yeah.
That doesn't help.
No, it really doesn't. Thank you, Frank. That's a lovely start, and it's a great point that Henry picks up on as well. I just need to check something, because sometimes I don't read things to the end. Oh, no, that's all right. I thought you were going to say, please don't say my name. But he's written, please don't retire just yet. I'm only 28 and I need at least another decade of listening to you to cope with my work. I'm not making any promises, Henry, but I'll be here tomorrow. Hi, James, he writes, I work in construction, so working from home is obviously not an option. However, the industry is so backwards because they just seem to think that employees pumping more hours is a direct correlation to productivity. It's exactly what we were just touching on. It's a bit, at first glance, it's a bit counterintuitive, but the more you think about it, the more sense it makes. Henry goes on, I do 60 hours a week and I'm absolutely exhausted by the end of it. Whereas if we have the incentive of overtime, as in a bigger hourly rate, or knocking 10 hours a week off our shifts, but with the same output demanded and the same pay as we get for the 60 hours, I guarantee the productivity levels would be higher, turnover rates would be lower, as in staff turnover, and everyone would be more content. I really, truly don't understand it. As in, I really, truly don't understand why this isn't commonplace. I'm very, very busy on the phones, which is great, but I would love to add that question, which is where does it come from? Is it a post-Victorian thing? Is it this idea that you've got to get them in for as long as you possibly can, doing as much as they possibly can, when the more you think about it, the more you will recognise that means I'm going to be a less effective employee. It's like commission. You're selling stuff and you're on commission versus selling stuff when you're not. But then if you're only on commission, the pendulum swung a little bit too far. Do you see what I mean? I just find this really interesting. Gurdip's in Leamington Spa. Gurdip, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I was just talking to the lady beforehand, and I was saying that COVID forced. So I have a beauty salon, and forced us to run two teams because we thought if one got knocked out, the other one could pick up the client. So this has all happened really organically, and so we had to go from 6 days to 7 days in order to give the team as much contracted hours as possible, but they were all about still 5 hours short, so we took a hit and increased their salary, and they took a bit of a hit, and we sort of tried to make it work. So cut a long story short, the girls will only ever work a 3 or a 4 day week so that we could get the whole team in. It meant that occupancy went up.
Right.
It meant that in our industry, it's quite rare, but every team member got every other weekend off because they were working the shifts. And the return has been amazing.
Wow.
Our team work less hours, they're less tired, they're less exhausted. Mums have come back into industry, which was, again, rarely heard of because it was just such an unpopular shift for mums because they have kids to look after. So now they don't have to be, they don't need childcare every day because they're not in the salon every day. They don't have to rely on mum and dad or, every other weekend because they're not in the salon every other weekend. So it's had quite a positive impact. And me and my business partner both followed suit and only work a 3 or 4 day week. And we don't want to change it either.
It is. I said, didn't I, in the introduction that this could turn into a no-brainer the longer the conversation goes on. And what's interesting about it in the area of alchemy is that we're human beings, not robots. So this idea, it's not just some sort of trite slogan on a tea towel, is it? If your staff are happier, they will do a better job.
Yeah, but I think the reason people are resistant to it, and us as well, it was COVID that forced it. So our hand got forced, and we now see the results of it. So it wasn't like I was like, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to try it, because it's quite daunting trying to do something. It's almost like going against the wind of what we've known forever,
Yes,
it's like
exactly.
Something totally.
Yeah, if it was such a good idea, we'd have done it before. We'd have done it years ago. There must be a reason why normal is normal.
Yeah, and so I think once now that we've done it, none of us, including me and my business partner, want to go back to the old way.
And you won't. You don't need to.
No. And we've gone 7 days, which means the salon's open more days. Clients are happy.
Yeah.
We've taken more team on because we've got the room occupancy to make it happen.
Right.
And the therapists are happy. So, it's a bit of a win-win.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you were listening today. And you probably wouldn't have been able to if you weren't on the new flexible working patterns, because you'd have been busy applying your trade. Gurdit, thank you. And James picks up another point. The large drop in turnover shouldn't be overlooked. Gurdit referred to that as well. Lower staff turnover. So it's not just a cost saving on training new staff, but keeping the best people who know the job well can boost productivity beyond even their own role. So it's all queuing up for the good. I think it was Tim who pointed out that they've actually just done the opposite in Greece. And that's very true. Greece last week, the government announced a new 6-day week policy for private companies aimed at boosting the economy amid a shrinking population and shortages of skilled workers. So it'll be very, very interesting to see, won't it, whether or not longer hours from workers turbocharges productivity, or whether or not counterintuitively at first glance they would actually increase productivity by reducing the hours. The problem you've got here on a national level is workforce, isn't it? So Gurdit beautifully explained about how they've actually now got more people on the payroll than they had before. But what if there weren't enough people to fill the gaps on the payroll thrown up by the 4-day week? That's the problem that Greece is facing. And they've still got freedom of movement as well. So goodness knows what our problems are like compared to theirs. I just can't... I mean, where would you rather be? In a country where the government was ordering you to work 6 days a week, or a country where your employer was offering you the same salary for a 4-day week? You'd much rather take the second option if it was you. But then we're back to that classic Tory outlook on life of it being, well, no, that'd be perfect. I'd be honourable. I'd behave perfectly well. I'd be very, yes, I'd be, but no, the plebs. You can't let the plebs have that kind. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile, old boy. Daryl's in Camberley. Daryl, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Hi. Good afternoon. Long time listener, first time caller.
Welcome aboard.
I did work as a consultant in this space for a little while as helping companies embrace and get on board with a 4-day week.
Yeah. Are you all right? You sound like you've got something else going on.
Yeah, no, sorry. There's just I've just had to pull over.
Okay.
I think this is a cultural thing as much as anything else.
Definitely.
And it isn't. I think the people that are in this space, it isn't a benefit. It's a cultural shift. And I think the advantage of this comes when the concept of it is introduced to a team, and the leadership team say, look, we're considering doing this. Who's interested? And invariably, the majority of the people put their hands up. Obviously, they've got questions, but they put their hands up.
Yeah.
You then kind of posit the question. Okay, well, you know what you need to get done in any given week. How do you think we should do it? And what you do is that you make the teams then part of the conversation.
Yes.
And then that it levels the playing field, because typically, I know you've used the Victorian mill owner thing, which is obviously the 19th century kind of thing, is that there is a very parent-child or an adult-child kind of relationship in the workplace at the moment. You will turn up, this is what you do, this is when you leave, and then we'll pay you. Well, giving people that freedom and that responsibility to kind of own a little bit more of what they do, it then gives that kind of that tended garden thing, and it bonds people, and that people have each other's backs, and it just levels it. So then you've got an adult situation.
I think that's a huge part of it. It touched on it with an earlier caller, and try to think of it in simple terms. Something. This might sound a bit silly. Trying to work out why it would improve productivity. You're not being lazy on the 5-day week, but on the 4-day week, because you've got everything in your head and you've got a sense of responsibility, you just walk a bit quicker. If you're working in a supermarket and you've got to stack the shelves, you can move a little bit quicker, can't you?
You can. I mean, there is a holistic aspect to this as well. I know that we love to measure everything, but it is very difficult. It's like saying, okay, well, measure the benefits of yoga. I mean, it's
I know it's good for me, but I couldn't do you a flow chart.
Exactly, it's very hard to sort of to kind of like get a ven out of it. But and you know, other callers have touched on the advantage to helping elderly or the young, or being home to do this or that, and levelling equality in the house at home in terms of domestic duties and everything. There are so many benefits, and having that flexibility. But I think it needs to be underpinned by a good grown-up manager.
Yeah, and not suggesting that you're throwing a bone to the workforce. You're just changing the nature of the relationship. And although your mate who's still working a 5-day week might be jealous of your 4-day week, it's not to be viewed. That's why you used the word benefit at the beginning. I didn't fully understand why, but I do now. Daryl, thank you. It is 12:32. Amelia Cox is here with your headlines. It's 25-1. I love this. I love these sort of conversations. The idea that 2 employers have experimented with a 4-day week. If you're just joining us, if you're already on side, then I'll be brief. But 20 Asda stores invited staff who were working a 44-hour week to spread it over 4 days instead of 5 for the same salary. And it's failed. Workers are really unhappy, largely because they're exhausted. But South Cambridge District Council, a Liberal Democrat-controlled authority, invited staff to do the same amount of work over 4 days that they were previously doing on 5 days for the same salary. But the hours that they spent at the coalface, as it were, the hours that they spent at work, was reduced. So they were expected to carry out 100% of their work in 80% of the time for 100% of the pay. And this one's worked a treat. Not only in terms of productivity, chiefly I would say the 39% fall in staff turnover, particularly among the refuse collectors, because that is presumably quite backbreaking work and quite unpleasant in many ways. And so the fact that you've got 3 days off instead of 4 means you're going to stay in the job longer, which saves money in every conceivable corner, doesn't it? Because you're not paying for agency staff, you're not paying to train people, you're not absorbing absences from people who've had enough but haven't knocked it on their head. They reckon it saved £371,500 in a single year. And crucially, the scores for employees' physical and mental health, motivation and commitment had all improved during the trial. So 1 4-day week trial works a treat, 1 4-day week trial fails, and the reasons why are pretty blimmin' obvious. So why do we do more on a 4-day week if we're getting the same pay but fewer hours? Why do we end up doing more on those days than we would have done when we were doing a 5-day week? Jane's on the Wirral. Jane, what would you like to say?
I'm going to treat this a bit like mystery hour, James.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you what, play your cards right, you'll get a round of applause.
Well, I'll go for it. Before I got myself involved in politics, I was a project planning facilitator, and I planned about 1,000 different projects for over 30 years for industry and all sorts of different things. And one of the things is industry standard figure is if you have somebody working full time and you give them a week's work, you have to add an extra. You have to assume that they're only going to be 60% efficient.
Right.
So you actually add time on for the work because they will not be able to do it full time, even if they're trying. And you've heard a lot of the reasons why, but it's stress, it's distraction, it's thinking how hard done you are and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And the reason going for it, you've heard a lot of the reasons why it works going for a shorter period, but one of the most important ones is something called the student factor. If you give somebody a week to do something, they'll take a week.
Yes.
And actually, they'll probably take just short of a week and ask for extra time and then take the extra time as well.
I adopt that approach when I'm writing books.
Absolutely. But if you've only got 3 days to write it, you'll write in 3 days.
Yes. That old line from Douglas Adams about loving deadlines. He loves the noise they make as they whoosh by. But you wouldn't have that option if the culture of management was different. You'd know that you had to deliver it by tea time on Wednesday.
And you tend to. That's literally, that is the single most important factor. So 60% efficiency is what you have to factor in. And it's been done before. Iceland, 2015.
What, the country or the shop?
No, the country, not the shop.
No, it was actually a valid question. I wasn't trying to be funny.
Not a direct competition answer. No. They did a 3,000 worth of trial, I think it was, switched to a 4-day week, and they got it went so well. I can't remember how effective it was, but it was ridiculously effective. 80% of Iceland is now on a 4-day week.
Is that right? And does it stay?
Yeah.
And so, because what you're describing is that 60% efficiency rate going closer to 90, and then it stays around 90, does it?
Yes, it does.
Because we are humans, but we are machines in a way. When we need to be looked after, we need to feel valued. These are the things that you can't put into a statistical algorithm. You need to feel valued, and you need to feel motivated and happy. All of the things that Keith and Eleanor and Roxy talk about every day, how valued they feel and how motivated. And sometimes I buy them biscuits, all sorts of little treats. All right, I've never bought them biscuits, but these are not things you can put through an algorithm until you're actually measuring efficiency and trying to work out why it's gone up.
Precisely.
Oh, I like this. Qualifications?
Oh, well, I was a project planning manager for, actually was responsible for all innovation in Unilever for, God knows, 20 years.
Oh, well, it's a round of applause. There we go. But Unilever doesn't have a 4-day week in place, does it? I know they're not your employer anymore. And so actually, final question then, where does the resistance come from? If the research supports the scheme so completely, where does the resistance come from?
Staid views of upper management, I would say.
And the kind of people drawn into upper management will be the kind of people who want to micromanage and do the opposite of what the research suggests would improve things. Karen, I think, knows what I'm talking about. She goes, I was a micromanager until the people I was in charge of told me to trust them. I wasn't aware that I was annoying. I thought I was making their life better. So I took my foot off the pedal. Shifts became more fun. We had each other's backs, and we used our initiative to move out of our lanes. You don't add whether or not productivity went up or down, Karen, but I'm going to presume that it went up. Jane, lovely stuff. Thank you. Anthony's in Richmond. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hello. So I actually saw a video. This is basically coming up to the start of April where my leave reset.
I had
loads of days. Yeah, annual leave, sorry, yeah. I had loads of days sort of left that I needed to use. But I saw a video online where they said rather than doing the extra day on the Monday or the Friday, do it on the Wednesday because it splits the week up. I thought I'd give it a go. So I did it for about a month. Wednesday I took off for a month. And it basically, because I thought I'm always one day away from having a day off. It's like having a Thursday, Friday feeling all the time of it's nearly the weekend.
Just get through tomorrow and I've got a day off.
Exactly, yeah. So you become a lot happier in that sense. It's also a lot more productive because you are having a rest every 2 days.
So how do you know it's more productive? Because you just not got that. I sometimes actually say on the show, Anthony, if it's a Friday, I'll say, I can't do that topic today. I'll do it on a Monday because I need to have a bit. I need to have a bit of bounce in order to take on some of the subjects that I wouldn't do when I'm feeling a bit jaded. So it would be the same in your line of work.
But you wouldn't feel that on the Friday if you had the Wednesday off.
No, you wouldn't. You're absolutely right.
Because you'd have that bounce, wouldn't you? Already.
But you were taking it as holiday. You haven't got an employer who introduced a 4-day week. Do you reckon you were getting as much done over the 5 days as you were when you worked all 5?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, but I don't know. It's weird how I'm structured. Cause I'm a carpenter. I'm working repairs. So it's all we go to a job and our jobs are pretty much laid out for us. But I definitely. Sometimes, say they give me an hour and a half to do a job, before I think, that's not enough time, I have to rebook it for another appointment. Yeah. Whereas then I'm actually thinking, no, I've got the energy to do this now. I can rush around and get it done, sort of thing. Because you do just feel more rested, you know.
Yeah.
You're not as tired.
And these are the things that the kind of managers that Jane referred to probably don't appreciate or even perhaps register or acknowledge that kind of sense that you will. I don't know why I keep thinking of a bloke at River Island in Worcester in the early 1990s, who used to make me fold jumpers that I'd folded already. I used to stand there steaming, seething with rage. And it's like almost a form of workplace bullying. I said, there's no customers. What are you doing? I said, I'm waiting for some customers to come in. And I will say, go and fold those jumpers. I folded them this morning. I folded them already. This morning, I fold them again. So you've got this little plastic template. Have you ever done this? A plastic template and some tissue paper. And you've put the thing there and the tissue paper there, and you fold the jumper over the template, and you pull the template out, and you put them all in perfectly neat stacks, and they look great, and that is part of my job. But why on earth would you make me do it again if I'd just done it 10 minutes ago? That's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. I bet you I sold more jeans and kickers when he was not on duty than I did when he was, because I was in a better mood. Tim's in Guildford. Tim, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. How are you?
Very well, Tim. What's on your mind? Well, I say I'm very well. I'm just reflecting, actually, on the unlikelihood of radio presenters ever really being able to take advantage of a 4-day week.
Well, there you go. There you go. So listen, James, I can't talk specifically to a 4-day week, but what I can do is talk to the experience of what it is that my company does. So
yes.
my company provides a digital platform that connects businesses to a huge army of freelance workers.
Oh, yeah, cool.
So what happens is you have, you might be a hospitality business or a logistics business or a retail business, and you have open shifts, and you post them on our platform, and we have a whole army of workers that then start applying for them, and you can pick and choose. And the reason that I mention this is because this is very much the way that we see the workforce operating going forward. So to give you some numbers now, right now, about 25% of the UK workforce is Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on your pronunciation, and that's going to rise to about 50% by 2040. One of the big 4 consultancy companies, won't say which one, spoke to thousands of these Gen Z workers, and number one top priority for them when seeking work is the opportunity to pick and choose when and where and for whom they work. So the idea is for businesses, and this could be the same going forward for local authorities as well, if you don't tap into this workforce, you're simply not going to find sufficient workers. Now, by giving these workers the opportunity to pick and choose when and where and for whom they work, we have found that they are happy. They are not. There's a phrase going around in our industry which is people no longer want a job for life. They want a job and a life. They want to be able to work. They want to be able to work.
This is very much part of the same process, isn't it? There's another angle to it that you're probably aware of, but I wasn't. Paul's been in touch. He works in recruitment and retainment as well. And he says that even some potential staff, some job seekers who don't want the flexibility for themselves, don't want to work for a company that doesn't offer it because it's seen as a culture indicator that implies an overall lack of trust and a higher likelihood of micromanagement. So the more trust you show in your workforce, or the more freedom that you give to your workforce, the better the workforce becomes. Even those who don't necessarily want the freedom for themselves, they just like what it says about the relationship, the culture, the workplace culture.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, would it be remiss of me to mention the company that I work for? Is that okay, James?
I'm glad you've checked. It's a bit cheeky, but because you asked, I will allow you to on this occasion.
That's very kind of you, sir. So the company is called Temper, and we can be found at temper, temper.works, WORKS. That's where workers can find work. So what we have found is that what we've built into our platform is that when our workers go in, and they complete a shift, when they check out at the end of their shift, which is submitting their timesheet, I guess, the employee or the company that they work for has the opportunity to rate their performance. Therefore, each worker is duty bound to deliver the very best that they possibly can do, because that will affect their overall rating, which can affect their chances of getting
like a sort of like a trip advisor for staff, and yet you also, of course, then can do some research to see what the relationship is between productivity, performance, productivity, and the shift patterns that they're working, or the freedom that they are being offered. Tim, thank you, and I appreciate your politeness. It doesn't mean I'll say yes to everybody, though. I don't want to set any precedents on this one. Christos suggests that I could do a 4-day week. I just do a 4-hour show every day, get 5 days worth of topics into 4, a bonus mystery hour, and then play out recordings on the Friday. That wouldn't work, would it? I don't think. And what was the other one? No, can't find it. Oh, no, there it is. I turned down a job last year because it was 5 days in the office unless you were the boss. Yeah, that wouldn't work, would it, as well? It's all changing, and you can hear the dinosaurs howling sometimes. Working from home was a great example of that, the howling coming from dinosaurs who wouldn't even be affected by it particularly, but just hated the idea. And this will suffer similarly, as Jane explained. It's a sort of resistance from management. 12:48 is the time. 12:51 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where in some ways I think I've enjoyed the conversation that has nothing to do with politics as much, if not more, than the conversations that we've had about politics today. Maybe we've all got a degree of fatigue, but I am profoundly interested in the style and the speed with which the new government members, individual members of the new government, come out of the blocks. We heard from the Home Secretary earlier, and it is now the turn of the Chancellor. Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent, has been keeping a close eye and ear on Rachel Reeves's speech, and it really is a sort of a combination of both to-do list and description of what she can see in the rearview mirror. Aggie.
That's exactly right. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of new announcements in this speech. This was stuff that she said over the campaign that they would be doing. And she sort of made a virtue of that and basically said, we want to stick to our manifesto commitments. So the key announcements were, she said that they'll bring back compulsory house targets. They want 1.5 million houses over the next few years. They want to scrap the end of onshore wind ban. They want to create a new task force to accelerate stalled housing sites in our country. But a lot of her speech was making the point about how difficult things are for her now that the Tories have been in charge for 14 years.
I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that. Our economy has been held back by decisions deferred and decisions ducked.
So she said she's also instructed the Treasury over the weekend to provide an assessment on the state of the nation's spending inheritance, which she said she'll present to Parliament before the next recess. But unsurprisingly, the thing she wanted to talk a lot about was growth, how they're going to get growth, and she thinks these planning reforms are the way to do it.
Where previous governments have been unwilling to take the difficult decisions to deliver growth, or have waited too long to act, I will not hesitate. Growth was the Labour Party's mission in opposition. It is now our national mission. There is no time to waste.
How long have we got to map the difference between growth as a word and growth as a reality? Because we could sit here now and say she sounds very fluid, she sounds very confident, she sounds that she's well up for the job. But, I mean, at what point do we start measuring whether or not these things are actually happening? Growth is not, as we've discovered in recent years, something that governments have full control over, for example.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question how long their honeymoon period will actually be and how much they manage to keep making things the Tories' problems. I mean, I remember in 2010, that coalition, David Cameron, George Osborne, did a pretty good job of blaming the Labour government. I mean, they were still, even last year, waving around that Liam Byrne, there's no money left.
I had a caller on Friday who still referred to that Liam Byrne letter, which is a sign of a gaslit population. But as you say, they were following the lead of Cameron and Osborne. So, that's why perhaps getting the Treasury to do some of the homework will help in establishing precisely what is inherited and what is on them.
Yeah, I think so. And I think basically you've heard it a lot. I mean, you heard a lot in the campaign, Sue Gray drawing up this list of all the problems that Labour are going to inherit. And basically, if they just spend the next few days and weeks and indeed months talking about, well, the Tories have left us this, the Tories have left us that. And actually, I thought Paul Johnson from the IFS was quite interesting during the campaign because he said the idea that they come in and then ask the Treasury to open the books is sort of ridiculous because actually the books are wide open. They can see the problems that the country is facing already. But I think we will hear a lot more about the difficult inheritance, and every single cabinet minister is already doing it. You heard Wes Streeting saying the NHS is broken. You heard Keir Starmer over the weekend saying prisons are broken. And
they've used the word broken a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously, as the author of How They Broke Britain, I'm delighted with this development, this syntactic development. But it is, it's a big word for politicians to use. It describes the scale of the problems that they face, but it's also, it could be quite arresting for a population to be told that the NHS is broken. If I talk like that on the radio, people listening get scared about their next operation or they get scared about their likelihood of seeing a GP.
And also then you have to fix it. And at what point does it get fixed? Because, Labour have said what they want to do with the NHS. They've said what they want to do on prisons, but it's going to be really difficult. And at what point do you get to the point where you say, okay, don't worry, guys, it's no longer broken. We have now fixed it. And they're not giving loads of tangible targets and loads of tangible things they want to do. I mean, their manifesto is pretty small in scope. And I think part of that was so that they can say they've delivered on the small things in the manifesto. But it will be interesting to see how long it takes them to start saying, OK, we've nearly fixed it or we fixed it.
And we'll be watching. There was no equivalent. So Yvette Cooper this morning talking about trying to claw back some of the cash that has been expended, some of the £310 million or thereabouts expended on the Rwanda debacle. I was hoping that Rachel Reeves might return to some territory that she definitely visited in 2023 when she spoke about COVID corruption and having a sort of czar who would look into some of these contracts and the award of these contracts. Nothing today in this speech on that issue.
Nothing today on this speech, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Very popular
soon.
move. And it doesn't even have to deliver, because if it doesn't deliver, it doesn't deliver. Everyone just remembers that you said we'll go after the people who possibly were filling their boots inappropriately. Aggie Chambray, thank you so much. Welcome to the team. It's your first time, I think, on this programme.
It is indeed. Thanks for having me.
It is coming up to, speaking of new arrivals, Sheila Fogarty.
She's an old hand on mine.
Floated into
I've
the...
had her in loads. What took you so long?
I didn't get the chance, frankly.
You were playing hard to get, weren't you?
I always play hard to get. I got one more call on the 4-day week, I think, and we'll go to Jamie, who's in Bath. Not the Bath, although if you have a 4-day week, I suppose you can have more baths. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Big fan of the show. I just want to have an opinion, basically. I have experience of working a 4-day week and very much not so have experience of working a much longer week. So when I worked a 4-day week, it was basically due to health. I had to sort of reduce my stuff with Crohn's disease, and basically I had to sort of have a bit of time out. So I went down to a 4-day week, and the benefits were amazing in the sense of it enabled me to have more time to do more recreational things, to focus on my health, to focus on my gut health. I could cook more often, make fresh food, bake. I got into a good routine with exercise and swimming and all of those sorts of things.
Because sometimes it feels like there isn't enough time to get on top of the stuff that you need to get on top of.
I'm very much...
But did you, because we're going to run out of time, I just want to pin down one thing if I can. Did you get as much work done on the 4 days as you previously did across 5? Nearly.
Yeah. Probably yes and no.
Yeah.
The biggest problem for me was that I had to take a bit of a financial hit, so it wasn't sustainable.
Right.
Unfortunately, now I run my own business. I've got my own soft landscaping gardening business.
That's nice.
And so I'm much more the other end now. I never stop working and I'm exhausted. And I don't swim too much anymore.
No, well, it is.
I don't cook every night.
It's all about balance. Although I suppose that if it's your own company, it's a different type of exhaustion. It's a different psychic toll that it takes on you because you feel that you're building something for yourself. You leave me, Jamie, with an opportunity to pull out one of my favourite dad jokes, which is the bloke who took his employee into the car park at the factory. Where he was the boss, and showed him his new Porsche and put an arm around his employee and said, there you go, you see, if you work very, very hard, I can get another one of those next year, which is one of my all-time favourites. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.